Hey everyone, tonight we journey into the darkest corners of the Star Wars galaxy to uncover the complete story of Emperor Vitiate, the immortal Sith Lord whose hunger consumed entire worlds and whose shadow stretched across 1,000 years of galactic history. From his beginnings as an innocent child named Tenebrae to his transformation into the most terrifying force the galaxy has ever known. This is a tale of ultimate power, cosmic horror, and the price of immortality itself. So before you settle in for tonight's epic journey, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I noticed that about 90% of you listening to these stories aren't subscribed yet, and hitting that subscribe button really helps me continue creating these detailed galactic tales for you. Also, if you're fascinated by the intricate political machinations and epic fantasy of Game of Thrones, you'll want to check out my new channel, The Raven's Tales. I've added the link in the description below, where we dive deep into the world of Westeros and beyond. I'd love to hear from you in the comments about where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is in your part of the world. There's something magical about knowing we're all sharing these stories together across different time zones and continents. Now, get comfortable, dim those lights, and let's begin this chronicle of darkness and power. In the final moments before his essence scattered across the cosmic winds, the being who had once been called Vitiate, who had consumed the life force of entire star systems, who had ruled as an immortal god-emperor for over a millennium, experienced something he had not felt in 1,500 years. Fear, true, primal, absolute fear. As his consciousness dissolved into the force itself, one thought echoed through the dying fragments of his mind. How had it come to this? How had a child born with the innocent name of Tenebrae become the galaxy's greatest nightmare? The answer lies buried in the ancient chronicles of the Sith, in the forgotten ruins of worlds that no longer exist, in the whispered legends of civilizations that were devoured so completely that even their names were erased from history. This is the story of a hunger that could never be satisfied, of power that corrupted not just the wielder but the very fabric of reality itself. Long ago, when the galaxy was younger and the Force flowed through channels that modern Jedi and Sith could barely comprehend, there existed a world called Medriaas. It was a paradise of verdant forests and crystal-clear rivers, where the Force sang through every living thing like a symphony of pure energy. The native Sith species had built their civilization in harmony with these natural rhythms, their pyramids and temples rising from the landscape like extensions of the world's own bones. But paradise, as all who study the ancient ways know, is fragile, and sometimes the most beautiful worlds give birth to the most terrible darkness. On this world of Medriaas, is in the year 1500 before the Battle of Yavin, a child was born whose very existence would reshape the understanding of what it meant to wield the dark side of the Force. His birth was attended by omens that the Sith Lords should have recognized. Lightning struck without clouds. Animals fled from 100-mile radius. The Force itself seemed to recoil from the presence of this newborn infant. His mother, a human woman of noble birth, named him Tenebrae, meaning darkness in the ancient tongue. She could not have known that she was christening the future destroyer of worlds. She could not have foreseen that her child would one day stand over the ashes of entire civilizations, having consumed their life essence to fuel his own immortal existence. The child's father was Lord Dramath, a Sith Lord of considerable power and cruelty. But even Dramath, who had tortured and killed countless beings in his rise to power, would have trembled had he known what his blood had helped create. For Tenebrae was not merely born with the ability to touch the dark side. He was born as if the dark side itself had chosen to take mortal form. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider this: every legend begins with a choice. Every monster was once someone's child. And sometimes, the most terrifying tales are those that show us how thin the line truly is between innocence and absolute evil. The chronicles of Tenebrae's transformation into Emperor Vitiate await. Let us begin where all such stories must begin, with the moment when fate first whispered its dark promises to a child who would listen and learn and hunger for more. In the days when the galaxy was vast and largely unexplored, when hyperspace routes were still being carved through the cosmic void by brave or foolish navigators, the world of Medriaas stood as a jewel among the Sith worlds. This was not the barren, lightning-scarred wasteland that would later be known as Nethema. No, in those ancient times, Medriaas was alive in ways that modern worlds could barely comprehend. The very air shimmered with force energy, visible to those with the sight as golden threads weaving between the massive sentinel trees that towered hundreds of meters into the crimson sky. These were not ordinary trees, but living conduits of the force itself, their roots drinking deep from underground rivers of pure energy that flowed like luminous veins through the planet's core. When the wind moved through their crystalline leaves, it sang with voices that spoke of secrets older than recorded history. The native Sith species had built their civilization to harmonize with these natural rhythms. Their pyramids and temples were not imposed upon the landscape, but grown from it, their dark stone walls pulsing with the same energy that flowed through the living world around them. Ancient glyphs carved into these structures told stories of the first Sith Lords, of their mastery over life and death, of rituals that could bend reality itself to their will. But it was in the great estates of the Sith nobility that the true power of Medriaas could be felt most keenly. Here, in gardens where every flower bloomed with colors that existed nowhere else in the galaxy, where fountains flowed with water that healed wounds and extended life, the ruling class of the Sith practiced their ancient arts. They were masters of the dark side, certainly, but they were also scholars, artists, and philosophers who understood that true power came not from destruction but from the ability to create and preserve. It was into this world of terrible beauty and beautiful terror that Tenebrae was born. His mother's estate sprawled across several kilometers of the most force-rich territory on Medriaas. The main house rose from the landscape like a natural formation, its walls carved from living rock that had been shaped by Sith alchemy into something that was both architecture and sculpture. Gardens flowed seamlessly into wild forest, and wild forest gave way to carefully tended groves, where the force energies were concentrated and refined for use in the ancient rituals. The woman who would give birth to the galaxy's greatest monster was herself a figure of tragic beauty. Born to one of the oldest human families to settle on Medriaas, she had married into Sith nobility and learned to navigate the treacherous politics of a world where power was measured not in credits or armies, but in one's ability to command the very forces of life and death. She was intelligent, cultured, and possessed of a keen understanding of Sith philosophy. She could trace her lineage back through generations of force-sensitive ancestors, each of whom had added their own knowledge to the family's accumulated wisdom. Her libraries contained texts that predated the formation of the Republic, scrolls written in languages that had been forgotten when the first Jedi Temple was built on Coruscant. But for all her learning, for all her noble blood and accumulated wisdom, she was utterly unprepared for what she had brought into the world. The child Tenebrae appeared normal at first glance. He was beautiful, as children of powerful Sith bloodlines often were, with the pale skin and striking features that marked him as nobility. His eyes were the deep gold that indicated strong force sensitivity, and his movements showed the unconscious grace that came from a connection to the cosmic energy that flowed through all living things. But there were signs. Had anyone been wise enough to read them? The child never cried. Not once in his first months of life. He watched everything with an intensity that was unsettling in one so young, as if he was studying the world around him with the calculating mind of a predator. And there were the servants who began to avoid his nursery, claiming that the room felt cold even when the fires burned bright, that shadows seemed to move independently of their sources when the child was present. His mother noticed these things but dismissed them as the natural manifestations of a powerfully force-sensitive child. She had read the ancient texts, knew the stories of young Sith who had displayed unusual abilities from birth. What she did not understand was that her son was not merely gifted with the Force. He was something far more dangerous, something that the old texts had only hinted at in their most terrifying passages. The child's father, Lord Dramath, was a figure of considerable power in the Sith hierarchy. He ruled his own domain with an iron fist, commanding both respect and fear from those who served him. But he was also a traditionalist who believed in the old ways of Sith honor and nobility. He saw the acquisition of power as a noble pursuit, a way of elevating oneself above the common masses and achieving something approaching immortality through one's deeds and legacy. He would visit his son irregularly, observing the child's development with the detached interest of a scholar studying a particularly interesting specimen. He noted the boy's intelligence, his unusual composure, his apparent immunity to the emotional outbursts that plagued most children. These he saw as signs of strength, evidence that his bloodline had produced a worthy heir. He could not have known that he was looking upon the future destroyer of worlds. The years of Tenebrae's childhood passed like a slow-burning ember in the heart of a great fire. To those who observed him, he appeared to be developing exactly as one might expect of a child born to such noble Sith lineage. He was precocious, certainly, displaying an intelligence that far exceeded his years and a composure that would have been remarkable in an adult, let alone a child barely past his 5th birthday. His tutors, hand-selected from among the most learned scholars on Medriaas, found themselves both impressed and subtly disturbed by their young charge. The boy absorbed knowledge with a hunger that seemed almost physical, devouring texts on Sith philosophy, galactic history, and the ancient arts with an intensity that left even the most dedicated academics feeling inadequate. He would sit for hours in the great library of his mother's estate, surrounded by scrolls and datapads, his young mind cataloging information with the methodical precision of a master strategist. But it was not merely his intellectual gifts that set him apart. There were moments when his tutors would catch glimpses of something else, something that made them unconsciously step back and lower their voices. The child's questions were always penetrating, always probing toward the heart of whatever subject was being discussed. But more than that, his questions revealed a mind that was not merely learning about power, but actively seeking to understand how it might be acquired, concentrated, and wielded. When they discussed the ancient Sith rituals, other children might have been fascinated by the dramatic stories or frightened by the darker implications. Tenebrae listened with the focused attention of a scholar taking notes for a future practical application. When they spoke of the great Sith Lords of the past, he did not ask about their victories or their legendary deeds. Instead, he wanted to know about their methods, their sources of power, and most tellingly, their failures. His mother watched these developments with a mixture of pride and growing unease. She had hoped that her son would prove worthy of his heritage, that he would grow to become a leader among the Sith nobility. But as the months passed, she began to notice changes that went beyond mere intellectual precocity. The child's eyes, once merely the golden color common to Force-sensitive individuals, had begun to take on deeper, more complex hues. Sometimes they seemed to shift and swirl like molten metal, and when he was particularly focused on something, they would glow with an inner light that reminded her uncomfortably of the ancient descriptions of the first Sith Lords. More disturbing still were the small incidents that began to occur around the estate. Servants would report that flowers in the garden withered when the child walked past, only to bloom again with renewed vigor once he had moved on. Animals, particularly the smaller creatures that inhabited the grounds, began to avoid areas where Tenebrae spent time. Birds would fall silent when he approached, and even the great sentinel trees seemed to bend their branches away from his presence. The child himself appeared oblivious to these manifestations, or perhaps he simply accepted them as natural. He continued his studies with unwavering dedication, displaying particular interest in the most ancient texts, those that dealt with the fundamental nature of the Force itself. His questions grew more sophisticated, moving beyond simple curiosity to probing inquiries about the relationship between life and death, the nature of consciousness, and the theoretical limits of Force manipulation. It was during his 6th year that the first truly disturbing incident occurred. One of the estate's servants, an elderly man who had served the family for decades, had been assigned to tend the gardens near the library, where Tenebrae spent most of his time. The servant, whose name was Kef, had always been fond of children and had initially been pleased to have a young master to care for. He would often bring the boy small treats or interesting flowers from the garden, simple gestures of kindness that had always been well received by the children of previous generations. But Tenebrae's response to these offerings was different. He would accept them with polite gratitude, but there was something in his manner that made the old servant increasingly uncomfortable. The child would examine each gift with the same intense focus he brought to his studies, as if he were analyzing not just the physical object but something deeper and more fundamental about its nature. One afternoon, as Kef was tending to the flowers near the library's great windows, he noticed that the child was watching him with unusual intensity. Tenebrae had set aside his reading and was observing the old man's work with the same focused attention he usually reserved for his most challenging studies. The servant, hoping to engage the boy in friendly conversation, began to explain what he was doing, describing the care that different plants required and the satisfaction that came from helping living things flourish. The child listened without interruption, his golden eyes never leaving the old man's face. When Kef finished his explanation, Tenebrae asked a single question that would haunt the servant for the rest of his life, however brief, that would prove to be, "What does it feel like when the life goes out of them?" The old man was taken aback by the question. He assumed the child was asking about the natural cycle of plant life, about the way flowers bloomed and faded with the seasons. He began to explain about dormancy and renewal, about how even apparent death was often just a temporary state in the endless cycle of growth and decay. But Tenebrae shook his head impatiently. "No," he said, his voice carrying a note of authority that was unsettling in one so young. "I mean, what does it feel like when you take the life from them, when you draw it out and make it your own?" The servant stared at the child, a cold fear beginning to creep up his spine. He tried to explain that he didn't understand the question, that he was merely a gardener who helped things grow, not someone who took life from living beings. But even as he spoke, he realized that the child's questions were not born of innocent curiosity. There was something in those golden eyes that suggested Tenebrae already knew the answer to his question, that he was not seeking information, but rather testing the old man's knowledge. The conversation ended there, but the servant found himself unable to forget the child's words. Over the following days, he began to notice other things that troubled him. Plants that he had tended for years began to show signs of unexpected decline. Not the gradual fading that came with age or seasonal change, but a sudden, inexplicable weakening that seemed to begin from within. Leaves would lose their vibrant color overnight, becoming pale and brittle. Flowers that had bloomed magnificently for decades would suddenly wilt and refuse to recover, no matter how carefully he tended them. At first, Kef attributed these changes to some sort of plant disease or environmental factor he had not noticed. But as the days passed, he began to see a pattern. The decline was always most pronounced in areas where the child spent time, and it seemed to spread outward from those locations, like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The realization, when it came, was so terrible that the old servant at first refused to believe it. But the evidence was undeniable. The child was somehow drawing the life force from the plants around him, feeding on their vitality to fuel his own growing power. It was not a conscious process, at least not yet, but rather something that was happening instinctively, as natural to him as breathing was to ordinary children. Kef knew that he should report what he had observed to the child's mother, that someone in authority needed to be made aware of what was happening. But he also knew that such accusations would be difficult to prove and potentially dangerous to make. The family's position in Sith society was powerful, and servants who spoke against their masters rarely fared well. Instead, he began to keep a careful record of his observations, documenting the patterns he had noticed and the gradual escalation of the phenomenon. He hoped that by gathering enough evidence, he might be able to present a case that could not be dismissed or ignored. It was a noble intention, but one that would ultimately cost him his life. The child, meanwhile, continued his studies with ever-increasing intensity. His understanding of Sith philosophy deepened, and he began to explore concepts that were considered advanced even for adult practitioners. He read extensively about the nature of the dark side, about the relationship between power and control, and about the theoretical possibilities of extending one's influence beyond the normal boundaries of life and death. His mother, increasingly concerned about her son's development, arranged for him to be examined by some of the most skilled Force users on Medriaas. These consultations were conducted discreetly, presented as routine assessments of the child's abilities rather than investigations into potentially dangerous phenomena. The results were both reassuring and deeply troubling. The examiners confirmed that Tenebrae possessed Force abilities that were extraordinary even by Sith standards. His potential power was estimated to be greater than that of most fully trained Sith Lords, and his understanding of Force theory was remarkably sophisticated for his age. But they also noted certain anomalies in his Force signature that they could not easily explain. Most Force-sensitive individuals, even those strong in the dark side, maintained a certain balance in their connection to the cosmic energy. Their power might be directed toward domination or destruction, but it remained fundamentally connected to the living force that flowed through all things. Tenebrae's signature was different. It seemed to exist in a state of constant hunger, drawing in energy from his surroundings, but never achieving satisfaction or equilibrium. The examiners compared it to a whirlpool or a gravitational well, a force that inevitably drew everything around it toward a central point of consumption. They had never encountered anything quite like it, and their reports were filled with technical language that barely concealed their unease. One of the senior examiners, a Sith Lord named Vitiate, who had spent decades studying the most esoteric aspects of Force manipulation, requested a private meeting with the child's mother. What he told her would change everything. "Your son," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "is not merely gifted with the Force. He is something else entirely, something that the ancient texts describe, but that we have never seen in living memory. He is what our ancestors called a Force wound, a being whose very existence creates a disturbance in the natural order of things." The mother listened in growing horror as the examiner explained the implications of this assessment. A Force wound was not merely a powerful Force user. It was a being whose connection to the cosmic energy was fundamentally different from that of normal individuals. Where others drew upon the Force to enhance their abilities, a Force wound consumed it, draining the life energy from everything around it to fuel its own existence. The ancient texts speak of such beings appearing at moments of great crisis, the examiner continued. They are both a symptom and a cause of cosmic imbalance, creatures that emerge when the natural order of things has been disrupted. Your son's existence suggests that something fundamental has changed in the galaxy's relationship with the Force, something that may have consequences far beyond what we can currently comprehend. The mother asked what could be done, whether there was any way to help her son develop normally despite his unusual nature. The examiner's response was not encouraging. "The texts suggest that Force wounds are not capable of normal development," he said. "They exist in a state of perpetual hunger that can never be satisfied. As they grow stronger, their need for life energy increases, and they become increasingly dangerous to everything around them." The only historical examples we have of such beings ended in catastrophe, with entire worlds being drained of life to feed their appetites. The conversation ended with the examiner's recommendation that the child be closely monitored and that preparations be made for more drastic measures. If his condition continued to deteriorate, the mother agreed to these precautions, but privately she hoped that her son might prove to be an exception to the historical pattern. It was a hope that would prove to be tragically misplaced. The servant, Kef, meanwhile, had continued his careful documentation of the strange phenomena surrounding the child. His records showed a clear pattern of escalation, with the life-draining effects becoming more pronounced and extending over greater distances. Plants throughout the estate were beginning to show signs of decline, and even some of the smaller animals had begun to weaken and die without apparent cause. But it was the old servant's final entry that would prove most prophetic. On the night before his death, he wrote a single line that captured the essence of what he had observed. The child does not merely use the Force, he devours it, and through it, he devours everything that lives. He is not learning to become powerful, he is learning to become hungry. The next morning, Kef was found dead in his quarters, his body showing no signs of violence or disease. He had simply died in his sleep, his life force apparently drained away during the night. The child Tenebrae was found sitting in the garden nearby, reading quietly from one of his advanced texts on Force theory. When questioned about the servant's death, the child expressed appropriate sadness and concern, but those who looked closely noticed that his eyes had grown noticeably brighter, and that the plants around him seemed to be flourishing with renewed vigor. The first transformation was complete. The innocent child named Tenebrae was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. And in the depths of his mind, barely perceptible even to himself, a voice began to whisper. It spoke of greater hungers, of vaster appetites, and of a destiny that would reshape the galaxy itself. The voice promised him everything he had ever dreamed of, and more. All he had to do was listen and learn and feed the growing darkness within his soul. The death of the servant Kef marked a turning point in the young Tenebrae's development, though to outside observers the change was subtle and gradual. The child continued his studies with the same intense focus, maintained his polite demeanor with visitors and family members, and showed no outward signs of the profound transformation that was taking place within his mind and spirit. But those who knew him well began to notice small differences in his behavior, alterations so slight that they might have been dismissed as the natural progression of a gifted child's maturation. His mother was the first to observe these changes. The boy's appetite for knowledge had always been voracious, but now it seemed to have taken on a more predatory quality. He no longer simply absorbed information passively, but actively sought out specific types of knowledge, particularly anything related to the manipulation of life force and the extension of natural limits. His questions during tutoring sessions became more pointed and practical, focusing less on theoretical understanding and more on actionable techniques. She found him one evening in the family's private archive, a restricted section of the library that contained some of the most dangerous and closely guarded Sith texts. The chamber was sealed by both physical locks and force barriers, protections that should have been impenetrable to anyone without extensive training and authorization. Yet there sat her 6-year-old son, calmly reading from a holocron that contained detailed instructions for rituals that were considered forbidden even among the Sith nobility. When she asked how he had gained access to the sealed chamber, Tenebrae looked up from his reading with those increasingly luminous golden eyes and simply said, "The barriers recognized my authority." There was no boastfulness in his voice, no pride in having accomplished something that should have been impossible for a child his age. He stated it as a simple fact, as if the ancient protections had acknowledged some fundamental truth about his nature. The holocron he was studying contained the recorded teachings of Darth Revan, one of the most powerful and dangerous Sith Lords in galactic history. The specific passage he was examining dealt with the theoretical possibilities of consciousness transfer, the ability to move one's essence from one physical form to another as a means of achieving practical immortality. It was advanced material that most adult Sith practitioners would have found challenging to understand, yet the child was reading it with the same ease that other children might have shown with simple adventure stories. His mother attempted to redirect his interest toward more appropriate subjects, but she found herself increasingly unable to influence her son's choices. When she suggested that he might enjoy spending time with other children of his age, he politely declined, explaining that he found their concerns trivial and their company unstimulating. When she encouraged him to develop interests outside of his studies, he agreed readily enough but invariably found ways to connect any new activity to his growing fascination with power and control. The estate's other inhabitants began to experience the effects of Tenebrae's presence more directly as the months passed. The phenomenon that had begun with the servant Kef's death expanded gradually but inexorably throughout the grounds. Plants withered and died in patterns that followed the child's daily routines. Animals began to avoid areas where he spent time, and those that could not escape his presence grew visibly weaker and more listless. The estate's head groundskeeper, a man named Voss, who had maintained the property for over 2 decades, found himself struggling to keep the gardens alive. Plants that had thrived for generations began to fail despite his best efforts. He replaced soil, adjusted watering schedules, and consulted with agricultural specialists, but nothing seemed to halt the slow but steady decline of the once magnificent landscaping. What troubled Voss most was the pattern of the deterioration. The damage was not random or evenly distributed, but seemed to radiate outward from specific locations, always areas where the young master spent significant amounts of time. The library gardens were the worst affected, but the phenomenon was spreading to other parts of the estate as the child's range of movement expanded. More disturbing still were the reports from the estate's other servants. They spoke in hushed tones of dreams that felt more like waking nightmares, visions of themselves growing old and weak, while the young master remained eternally youthful and vigorous. Some complained of feeling constantly tired despite adequate rest, while others reported a persistent sense of being watched or followed, even when they were alone. The child himself seemed oblivious to these effects, or perhaps he simply accepted them as natural consequences of his growth and development. He continued his studies with unwavering dedication, but his focus had shifted from broad learning to very specific areas of knowledge. He spent hours studying ancient texts about Sith alchemy, force-based healing and life extension, and the theoretical limits of consciousness manipulation. One text in particular seemed to capture his attention above all others. It was an ancient manuscript that described a ritual known as the Force walking technique, a method by which a sufficiently powerful Force user could bind the spirits of the dead to their will, drawing upon their knowledge and power to enhance their own abilities. The ritual was considered extremely dangerous even by Sith standards, as it required the practitioner to open their mind to potentially hostile entities that might attempt to possess or corrupt them. But as Tenebrae studied the detailed instructions, he began to see possibilities that the original authors had not considered. The ritual was designed to temporarily bind dead spirits for consultation or assistance, but what if it could be modified to create permanent absorption? What if the consciousness of the dead could be completely integrated into the practitioner's own awareness, adding their knowledge and power to an ever-growing repository of accumulated wisdom? The boy began to experiment with modified versions of the ritual, starting with small-scale tests on insects and other minor creatures. He would capture them alive, study their simple consciousness patterns, and then practice techniques for absorbing their life essence completely. The results were encouraging. Not only did he successfully drain the life force from his subjects, but he found that he could retain traces of their primitive awareness, adding their simple survival instincts and sensory capabilities to his own expanding consciousness. As his confidence grew, he began to work with larger and more complex subjects. Small mammals from the estate's grounds became his test subjects, and then larger creatures as his abilities developed. Each successful absorption added to his growing power and knowledge, but more importantly, it fed the strange hunger that had been growing within him since birth. The voice that had begun to whisper in his mind after Kef's death grew stronger and more distinct with each successful feeding. It spoke to him in ancient languages that he somehow understood despite never having studied them, telling him stories of power beyond imagination and promising him a destiny that would reshape the galaxy itself. The voice told him of the true Sith, the original species that had given birth to the dark side philosophy that now dominated half the galaxy. It spoke of their mastery over life and death, their ability to consume entire worlds to fuel their immortal existence, and their ultimate goal of bringing the entire universe under their dominion. Most importantly, it told him that he was their chosen heir, the one who would complete the work that they had begun millennia ago. As Tenebrae listened to these whispered promises, he began to understand that his current situation was merely the beginning of a much larger journey. The estate where he lived, the family that had raised him, even the world of Medriaas itself, were nothing more than starting points for a destiny that would ultimately encompass the entire galaxy. But first, he would need to establish his authority over his immediate environment. The local Sith Lords who governed the various regions of Medriaas would need to be brought under his control, either through persuasion or more direct methods. His father, Lord Dramath, would need to be dealt with, as would any other potential rivals who might challenge his growing power. The boy began to plan his next moves with the same methodical precision he had applied to his studies. He identified the key power brokers in the local political structure, studied their weaknesses and ambitions, and developed strategies for manipulating them to his advantage. He was still only 6 years old, but his mind worked with the calculating intelligence of a master strategist who had spent decades honing his skills. His first target was his father's closest advisor, a Sith Lord named Calith, who had served as Lord Dramath's right hand for over a decade. Calith was known for his intelligence and loyalty, but also for his ambition and his frustration with his subordinate position. Tenebrae recognized that the advisor could be turned if approached correctly, and he began to cultivate a relationship with the man during his father's visits to the estate. The process was subtle and gradual. Tenebrae would engage Calith in seemingly innocent conversations about Sith philosophy and galactic politics, demonstrating an understanding of complex issues that impressed the older man. He would ask thoughtful questions about Lord Dramath's policies and decisions, questions that subtly highlighted potential weaknesses or alternative approaches. Most importantly, he began to demonstrate his growing power in small but significant ways. During one of Calith's visits, the advisor mentioned his chronic pain from an old injury sustained in a lightsaber duel. Tenebrae offered to help, placing his small hands on the man's injured shoulder and channeling force energy into the damaged tissue. The relief was immediate and profound, but what Calith did not realize was that the healing came with a price. The boy had not simply used the force to accelerate natural healing processes. He had drawn life force from other sources, primarily the plants and small animals around the estate, and transferred it into the advisor's body. The healing was real and lasting, but it created a subtle connection between Tenebrae and Calith, a bond that would allow the boy to influence the man's thoughts and emotions in ways that neither of them fully understood. Over the following months, Calith found himself increasingly impressed by the young master's wisdom and potential. He began to question some of Lord Dramath's decisions, comparing them unfavorably to suggestions that Tenebrae had made during their conversations. The advisor's loyalty to his longtime master began to waver as he came to believe that the boy represented a better path forward for their region of Medriaas. Tenebrae used similar techniques on other key figures in his father's organization. He would identify their weaknesses, both physical and emotional, and then provide seemingly miraculous solutions that bound them to him through a combination of gratitude and subtle force manipulation. A guard captain with a dying daughter found his child mysteriously restored to health after spending an afternoon with the young master. A minor lord struggling with financial difficulties discovered unexpected opportunities arising just after seeking the boy's counsel. Each success strengthened the growing network of loyalty and dependence that Tenebrae was weaving around himself. But more importantly, each use of his abilities fed the hunger that drove him and brought him closer to the ultimate goal that the voice in his mind had shown him. He was not merely building a power base among the local Sith Lords, he was preparing for something far grander and more terrible. The ancient texts had spoken of a ritual that could grant true immortality, not merely extended life but genuine freedom from the constraints of mortality. The ritual required enormous amounts of life force, far more than any single being could provide. It would necessitate the sacrifice of thousands of force-sensitive individuals, their combined essence absorbed and integrated into the practitioner's consciousness. Such a ritual had never been attempted on the scale that Tenebrae envisioned, but the voice in his mind assured him that it was not only possible but inevitable. The true Sith had laid the groundwork for such a ceremony millennia ago, encoding the necessary knowledge in hidden texts and preparing ritual sites that would channel the required energies. All that was needed was someone with the will and the power to bring all the pieces together. Someone who understood that true strength came not from conquest or domination, but from the complete consumption of all opposition. Someone who could look upon an entire world and see it not as a place to rule, but as a source of nourishment for an appetite that could never be satisfied. As Tenebrae continued his careful manipulation of the local power structure, he began to plan for the next phase of his development. The estate where he lived was no longer sufficient for his needs. He would need to expand his influence beyond the boundaries of his mother's property, to establish himself as a significant force in the broader politics of Medriaas. The time had come to announce his presence to the world, to step out of the shadows and claim his rightful place among the Sith Lords who governed the planet. But he would not do so as a supplicant or a student seeking recognition. He would present himself as what he truly was, a being whose power transcended the petty limitations that constrained ordinary mortals. The boy who had been born as Tenebrae was about to take his first steps toward becoming the entity that would one day be known as the Sith Emperor, and the galaxy would never be the same. By his 10th year, Tenebrae had transformed from a precocious child into something that defied easy categorization. To those who met him casually, he appeared to be a remarkably composed and intelligent young nobleman, possessed of wisdom far beyond his years and a natural charisma that drew others to seek his counsel. But to those who observed him more closely, who spent extended time in his presence and witnessed the subtle effects of his growing power, he had become something far more disturbing and magnificent. The estate that had once been his mother's pride had become a testament to his expanding influence. Where once gardens had bloomed with impossible beauty, now there were carefully maintained areas of controlled decay, spaces where the natural cycle of life and death had been accelerated and manipulated to serve his experimental needs. The great sentinel trees that had stood for centuries now bore strange fruit, their crystalline leaves having taken on new colors and properties under the influence of his presence. But these changes were merely the visible manifestations of a much deeper transformation. Tenebrae had spent years studying the ancient texts, mastering techniques that had been considered theoretical exercises by previous generations of Sith Lords. He had learned to see beyond the surface of reality, to perceive the fundamental energy patterns that connected all living things, and most importantly, to manipulate those patterns to serve his increasingly ambitious goals. The network of loyalty and dependence that he had built among his father's associates had grown into something approaching a shadow government. Key figures throughout Lord Dramath's domain now looked to the young master for guidance on important decisions, often without fully realizing that their thoughts and preferences had been subtly influenced by their interactions with him. The healing he had provided, the counsel he had offered, and the small demonstrations of power he had shared had created bonds that went far deeper than simple gratitude or political alliance. But Tenebrae's ultimate goal lay beyond the petty politics of regional governance. The voice that whispered to him in the quiet hours of the night had shown him visions of a destiny that encompassed not just Medriaas but the entire galaxy. The true Sith, it told him, had prepared the way for one who would complete their ancient work, who would bring order to the chaos of existence by imposing the ultimate unity of absorption and consumption. The key to this transformation lay in a ritual that had been attempted only once before in galactic history, and then only on a much smaller scale. The ancient texts spoke of it in hushed, reverent terms, describing it as the ultimate expression of Sith philosophy, the perfect fusion of knowledge, power, and will that could elevate a sufficiently prepared individual beyond the limitations of mortality itself. The ritual was known by many names in the various texts that referenced it. Some called it the ceremony of eternal consumption, others referred to it as the rite of universal absorption. But the name that resonated most strongly with Tenebrae was the simplest and most direct. It was called the Feast of Worlds, and it promised to grant not just immortality, but the power to consume entire civilizations to fuel one's continued existence. The theoretical framework was elegantly simple, though the practical implementation would require careful planning and enormous resources. The ritual would create a massive force-based vortex, a cosmic whirlpool that would draw in the life energy of everything within a carefully defined area. The practitioner would position themselves at the center of this vortex, absorbing and integrating all of the consumed life force into their own being. But the true genius of the ritual lay not in its scale but in its precision. Unlike crude methods of life draining that simply destroyed their targets, the Feast of Worlds would preserve the consciousness and memories of everything it consumed. The practitioner would not merely gain the raw life energy of their victims, but would also acquire their knowledge, their skills, and their understanding. A single successful performance of the ritual could grant the wisdom of entire civilizations along with the power of immortality. The texts suggested that such a ceremony had been performed once before, in the distant past, by one of the greatest of the true Sith Lords. The results had been spectacular, creating a being of such power and knowledge that it had been able to reshape entire star systems according to its will. But the texts also hinted at darker consequences, suggesting that the ritual's success had come with a price that had ultimately led to the downfall of the true Sith civilization. Tenebrae studied these warnings carefully, but rather than discouraging him, they only strengthened his determination to succeed where his predecessors had failed. He believed that their mistake had been one of scope and ambition. They had attempted to consume too much too quickly, overwhelming themselves with more power and knowledge than they could properly integrate. His approach would be more measured and methodical. He would begin with a single world, using the entire population of Medriaas as the raw material for his transformation. The planet's inhabitants were already accustomed to Sith rule and force-based manipulation, making them ideal subjects for such an experiment. More importantly, many of them possessed at least some degree of force sensitivity, providing a much richer source of energy than ordinary mortals could offer. The ritual would require careful preparation on multiple levels. First, he would need to gather the necessary participants, convincing them that they were taking part in a ceremony that would benefit all involved. The ancient texts suggested that willing participation, even if based on incomplete information, would make the absorption process more efficient and reduce the risk of resistance or backlash. Second, he would need to prepare the ritual site itself, a process that would involve years of careful work to align the natural force currents of the planet with the geometric patterns required for the ceremony. The text provided detailed instructions for these preparations, but they would need to be adapted to the specific characteristics of Medriaas and its unique energy profile. Finally, he would need to prepare himself, both mentally and physically, for the enormous influx of power and consciousness that the ritual would provide. The texts warned that improper preparation could result in madness or death, as the practitioner's mind struggled to cope with the sudden expansion of their awareness and capabilities. Tenebrae began his preparations during his 11th year, working with the methodical precision that had characterized all of his endeavors. He started by conducting a comprehensive survey of Medriaas, mapping the planet's force currents and identifying the locations where the necessary ritual components could be most effectively positioned. This process required him to travel extensively throughout the world, visiting regions that were controlled by various Sith Lords and establishing relationships that would prove crucial to his ultimate success. His approach to these regional leaders was masterful in its subtlety and patience. Rather than presenting himself as a rival or challenger, he positioned himself as a scholar and researcher interested in the ancient history of their world. He spoke of discovering lost knowledge that could benefit all of the planet's inhabitants, of rituals that could strengthen their connection to the Force and enhance their collective power. Many of the Sith Lords were initially skeptical of claims made by someone so young, but Tenebrae's demonstrations of knowledge and ability quickly overcame their reservations. He would arrive at each court bearing gifts of wisdom, sharing techniques and insights that had been lost for centuries. He healed the sick, solved political problems that had seemed intractable, and provided guidance that invariably led to increased prosperity and stability. But more than these practical benefits, he offered something that the Sith Lords had never experienced before, a vision of unity and cooperation that transcended the traditional patterns of competition and conflict that had dominated their society. He spoke of a great ceremony that would bind all of the planet's Force users together, creating a collective consciousness that would be far more powerful than the sum of its individual parts. The concept was seductive in its appeal to their deepest desires for power and significance. Each Sith Lord imagined themselves playing a crucial role in this grand undertaking, gaining access to knowledge and abilities that had been beyond their reach as isolated individuals. They began to compete with each other to provide assistance and support for Tenebrae's research, eager to secure their place in what they believed would be a glorious transformation. As the years passed and the preparations continued, Tenebrae's influence expanded until he had become the de facto coordinator of a planet-wide effort. Construction projects were undertaken across Medriaas, ostensibly to build temples and meditation centers that would facilitate the great ceremony. These structures were positioned according to precise geometric patterns that Tenebrae had derived from the ancient texts, creating a vast ritual circle that encompassed the entire planet. The Sith Lords contributed resources and labor to these projects with enthusiastic cooperation, believing that they were helping to build monuments to their collective greatness. They did not realize that they were actually constructing the components of a massive absorption device, a planetary-scale ritual apparatus that would channel their life energy directly into Tenebrae's waiting consciousness. The most challenging aspect of the preparation involved his own family and immediate associates. His mother had grown increasingly concerned about her son's activities and the changes she observed in his personality and behavior. She had consulted with various experts and advisors, seeking explanations for phenomena that seemed to defy conventional understanding. Lord Dramath had also begun to take notice of his son's growing influence, though his response was more political than parental. He recognized that Tenebrae's activities were creating new power dynamics on Medriaas, potentially threatening the established order that had maintained his own position for decades. Several times he attempted to assert his authority over his son's projects, only to discover that his own supporters and allies had been subtly undermined by their interactions with the boy. The confrontation between father and son was inevitable, and it came during Tenebrae's 13th year. Lord Dramath had finally realized the extent to which his son had manipulated the political landscape of their world, and he had come to understand that allowing these activities to continue would ultimately result in his own displacement and possible destruction. The meeting took place in the Great Hall of Lord Dramath's fortress, a massive chamber designed to intimidate visitors and demonstrate the Lord's power and authority. Dramath had arranged for his most loyal supporters to be present, intending to use their combined influence to force his son to abandon his increasingly dangerous activities. But when Tenebrae entered the hall, accompanied only by a small retinue of advisors, it quickly became apparent that the traditional dynamics of power and authority no longer applied. The boy moved with a confidence and presence that seemed to fill the vast space, and his voice carried an authority that made even the most experienced Sith Lords unconsciously defer to his words. He spoke to his father with respectful courtesy, acknowledging Lord Dramath's concerns and expressing his understanding of the difficult position that his activities had created. But he also made it clear that there could be no compromise on the fundamental question of who would control the future of Medriaas. The great ceremony, he explained, was not merely a research project or an exercise in Sith philosophy. It was the culmination of thousands of years of preparation, the fulfillment of prophecies that had been written before their civilization had even begun. The choice before them was not whether the ceremony would take place, but whether they would participate willingly as honored contributors or be consumed as unwilling victims. The ultimatum was delivered with such calm certainty that it took several moments for its implications to fully register. When Lord Dramath and his supporters finally understood what they were being told, their reactions ranged from incredulous anger to horrified realization. Some attempted to challenge Tenebrae's claims, demanding proof of his supposed power and authority. Others tried to organize resistance, calling for immediate action to stop what they now recognized as an existential threat to their world. But their efforts were futile from the beginning. The boy who stood before them was no longer the child they remembered. Years of careful preparation and gradual absorption of life force had transformed him into something that transcended their understanding of what a Sith Lord could become. When he demonstrated his power, it was with a casual ease that made their own abilities seem primitive and limited by comparison. With a gesture, he drained the life from several guards who had moved to restrain him, absorbing their essence so quickly and completely that they simply collapsed into dust. With another thought, he reached into the minds of his opponents, showing them visions of the ceremony to come and their role in it, whether willing or unwilling. The demonstration lasted only minutes, but it was sufficient to establish the new order of things. Lord Dramath's supporters found themselves faced with a choice between cooperation and annihilation, and most chose to embrace what they could no longer prevent. In the end, only Lord Dramath himself continued to resist, driven by a mixture of parental concern and political desperation. His final confrontation with his son was brief and decisive. Tenebrae showed him no mercy, but also no unnecessary cruelty. He simply reached out with the Force and drew his father's life essence into himself, adding Lord Dramath's knowledge and power to his own ever-growing collection. With his father's death, the last significant obstacle to the great ceremony had been removed. The Sith Lords of Medriaas as now acknowledged Tenebrae as their supreme leader, and the planetary scale preparations were complete. All that remained was to gather the participants and perform the ritual that would transform not just Tenebrae, but the very nature of existence itself. The date was set for the convergence of 3 moons, an astronomical alignment that occurred only once every several decades. The energy patterns of the planet would be at their peak during this time, providing optimal conditions for the massive force manipulation that the ceremony would require. As the appointed time approached, Sith Lords from across Medriaas began to gather at the primary ritual site, a vast complex of temples and meditation chambers that had been constructed at the intersection of the planet's most powerful force currents. They came believing that they were about to participate in a ceremony that would elevate all of them to new heights of power and understanding. They could not have known that they were walking willingly into the greatest betrayal in galactic history, or that their eager participation would provide the final components needed for a transformation that would echo across the centuries to come. The boy who had been born as Tenebrae was about to become something unprecedented in the galaxy's long history of darkness and light. The Feast of Worlds was about to begin. The transformation that occurred during the ritual of anathema defied every conventional understanding of what was possible through force manipulation. In a single moment that lasted both an eternity and an instant, the consciousness that had once been the child Tenebrae expanded to encompass the life force, memories, and accumulated wisdom of 8,000 Sith Lords and their countless servants. The sheer magnitude of this absorption would have destroyed any ordinary mind. But the entity that emerged from the ceremony was no longer bound by such limitations. Where once the planet Medriaas had teemed with life, now there was only silence. The ritual had consumed everything, from the mightiest Sith Lords to the smallest insects, leaving behind a world that existed in a state of absolute void. The very force itself seemed to recoil from the barren surface, creating a wound in reality that would persist for millennia to come. But from this devastation had emerged something unprecedented in galactic history, a being of such power and knowledge that it transcended every previous conception of what a Sith Lord could become. The entity that now called itself Vitiate stood alone upon the lifeless surface of what would forever after be known as anathema, contemplating the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The hunger that had driven the child Tenebrae was temporarily sated, filled with an enormous feast of consumed consciousness and stolen life force. But even as the immediate craving subsided, a new and far more terrible understanding began to take shape in the expanded awareness of the transformed being. The ritual had been successful beyond even the most optimistic projections contained in the ancient texts. Not only had it granted the immortality and power that had been promised, but it had also provided something far more valuable, a complete understanding of the true Sith legacy and the cosmic purpose that had driven their civilization across the eons. The accumulated knowledge of 8,000 Force users had revealed secrets that no single individual could have discovered through conventional study, patterns and connections that spanned the entire history of the galaxy. But with this knowledge came a disturbing realization. The hunger that had been temporarily satisfied was not truly gone, but merely transformed into something larger and more complex. The ritual had not eliminated the need for continued consumption, but had instead revealed the true scope of what would be required to achieve the ultimate goals that now burned in Vitiate's consciousness. The destruction of a single world, no matter how rich in force-sensitive life, was merely the first step in a process that would ultimately require the consumption of entire star systems, whole sectors of the galaxy, sacrificed to fuel an ever-expanding appetite for power and knowledge. This understanding brought with it both exhilaration and a strange form of melancholy. The being that had emerged from the ritual possessed memories and emotional connections spanning thousands of lifetimes, including those of beings who had loved and been loved, who had created beauty and meaning in their brief existences before being absorbed into the greater whole. These residual emotions created a complex psychological landscape within Vitiate's consciousness, a constant tension between the driving hunger for more power and a deeper appreciation for what was being destroyed in pursuit of that goal. But such concerns were secondary to the immediate practical challenges that lay ahead. The ritual had granted enormous power, but that power needed to be properly organized and directed if it was to serve the greater purpose that had been revealed. The entity that had once been Tenebrae now possessed the combined knowledge of every major Sith philosophy and technique that had been developed over the past several millennia. But integrating that information into a coherent worldview and practical methodology would require careful thought and planning. The first priority was to establish a new base of operations. Anathema, for all its symbolic significance, was no longer suitable as a center of power. The ritual had drained it of everything that made it valuable, leaving behind a dead world that served only as a monument to what had been accomplished. What was needed now was a location that could serve as the foundation for the next phase of expansion, a place where the knowledge and techniques that had been acquired could be developed and refined. The ancient memories absorbed during the ritual provided the answer. Among the consciousness patterns that now formed part of Vitiate's expanded awareness were those of explorer adepts who had mapped the unknown regions beyond the galactic rim, discovering worlds and civilizations that existed in isolation from the political structures that dominated the known galaxy. These hidden realms offered the perfect opportunity to establish a new empire, one that could grow and develop without interference from the Jedi or the various Republic factions that might oppose such expansion. The journey to these hidden worlds required careful preparation. While the ritual had granted enormous power, it had also created certain limitations and vulnerabilities that needed to be understood and managed. The consciousness that now called itself Vitiate was no longer entirely human, nor was it purely Sith in the traditional sense. It existed as something entirely new, a hybrid entity that combined elements of thousands of different beings into a single complex awareness. This hybrid nature provided tremendous advantages in terms of knowledge and capability, but it also created challenges in terms of maintaining coherent identity and purpose. The individual personalities that had been absorbed during the ritual had not been entirely eliminated, but rather integrated into a vast mental hierarchy, with Vitiate's original consciousness serving as the dominant organizing principle. Managing this internal complexity required constant effort and attention, and there were moments when conflicting memories and loyalties threatened to create psychological instabilities that could undermine the entire structure. To address these challenges, Vitiate developed a system of mental compartmentalization that allowed different aspects of the absorbed consciousness patterns to be accessed and utilized as needed while maintaining overall coherence and control. This system would prove crucial in the years to come, as the complexity of managing an expanding empire would require the simultaneous application of thousands of different skill sets and knowledge bases. The first expeditions to the unknown regions were undertaken with small fleets of loyal followers, Sith Lords and their retainers, who had survived the ritual by virtue of being absent from Medriaas as during the ceremony. These individuals had initially been devastated by the loss of their homeworld and the apparent death of their civilization, but Vitiate's demonstrations of power and promises of greater glory to come gradually won their allegiance to the new order. These early expeditions discovered a cluster of worlds that had been settled by refugees from various galactic conflicts over the past several millennia. The inhabitants were descendants of Sith, Jedi, Republic citizens, and various alien species who had fled to the unknown regions, seeking sanctuary from the endless wars that plagued the galaxy proper. Over the centuries, they had developed their own unique cultures and political systems, creating a complex tapestry of civilizations that existed in relative isolation from galactic affairs. For Vitiate, these worlds represented the perfect raw material for the construction of a new empire. The populations were small enough to be manageable but large enough to provide a substantial base of resources and manpower. More importantly, many of the inhabitants possessed at least some degree of force sensitivity, having descended from refugees who had fled the galaxy during periods when such abilities were either persecuted or highly valued. The conquest of these worlds was accomplished through a combination of military force, political manipulation, and demonstrations of overwhelming power that convinced local leaders that resistance was futile. But unlike the crude domination tactics employed by many Sith Lords, Vitiate's approach was characterized by a sophisticated understanding of social psychology and cultural dynamics that had been gleaned from the absorbed consciousness of thousands of different beings. Rather than simply destroying existing power structures and imposing Sith rule through fear and intimidation, Vitiate worked to co-opt and transform local institutions, gradually reshaping them to serve the goals of the expanding empire, while maintaining enough familiar elements to minimize resistance and cultural shock. Local religions were modified to incorporate Sith philosophical concepts while retaining their traditional ceremonies and symbols. Political systems were restructured to concentrate power in the hands of Force-sensitive leaders while preserving the appearance of traditional governance structures. This approach proved remarkably effective, allowing the rapid integration of conquered worlds into a cohesive imperial structure without the massive resistance movements and ongoing instability that typically characterized Sith conquests. Within a few decades, what had begun as a collection of isolated refugee settlements had been transformed into the foundation of a new empire that rivaled the established galactic powers in terms of resources and military capability. But Vitiate's ambitions extended far beyond simple conquest and territorial expansion. The true purpose of the empire was to serve as a massive research and development facility, a place where the knowledge absorbed during the Nathema ritual could be explored and extended through systematic experimentation and study. Every world that was brought under imperial control became a laboratory for testing new applications of Sith philosophy and Force manipulation, with entire populations serving as subjects for experiments that would have been impossible to conduct in the more heavily monitored regions of the galaxy. The most significant of these research programs focused on the development of new techniques for consciousness manipulation and life force absorption. The ritual that had created Vitiate had demonstrated the theoretical possibility of consuming entire worlds to fuel personal power, but the practical challenges of scaling such techniques to galactic proportions required extensive additional work. How could the process be refined to maximize efficiency and minimize waste? How could it be applied selectively to preserve valuable resources while eliminating unnecessary populations? How could it be performed remotely without requiring the physical presence of the practitioner at each target location? These questions drove research programs that spanned centuries and involved thousands of the Empire's most talented scientists and Force users. Entire worlds were designated as experimental sites, their populations subjected to various forms of life force manipulation as researchers worked to perfect the techniques that would eventually be applied on a much larger scale. The results of these experiments were carefully documented and analyzed, contributing to an ever-growing body of knowledge about the fundamental nature of consciousness and the Force. One of the most significant breakthroughs came from research into the relationship between physical embodiment and consciousness persistence. The absorbed memories from the Nathema ritual had included extensive knowledge about techniques for transferring consciousness between different physical forms, but these traditional methods were limited by the requirement for compatible host bodies and the gradual degradation that occurred with each transfer. Vitiate's researchers developed new approaches that eliminated many of these limitations, creating techniques for maintaining consciousness in purely energetic forms that could persist indefinitely without physical anchoring. These methods opened up entirely new possibilities for expansion and control, allowing the Emperor to project aspects of his consciousness across vast distances and to maintain multiple simultaneous presences throughout the Empire. The implications of this research extended far beyond personal power enhancement. If consciousness could be maintained and transferred without physical limitations, then the traditional boundaries between individual identity and collective organization became meaningless. An empire led by such a being would not be constrained by the communication delays and coordination challenges that had limited previous galactic powers. It could function as a single unified entity with perfect internal coordination and instantaneous response capabilities. But the development of such capabilities also revealed new challenges and complications. As Vitiate's consciousness expanded across multiple forms and locations, the psychological complexity that had emerged from the Nathema ritual became even more pronounced. Managing the conflicting memories and loyalties of thousands of absorbed personalities became increasingly difficult when those conflicts were spread across multiple simultaneous manifestations, each of which might experience different environmental pressures and social interactions. The solution to this problem required the development of sophisticated mental architecture that could maintain coherent identity and purpose across distributed consciousness networks. This architecture drew upon organizational principles that had been observed in the absorbed memories of various collective entities, including hive minds and force-bonded communities that had existed in different parts of the galaxy throughout history. The resulting system allowed Vitiate to maintain perfect coordination between different aspects of his consciousness while preserving the ability to adapt and respond to local conditions as needed. But it also created new vulnerabilities, as disruption to any part of the network could potentially affect the stability of the entire system. As the Empire continued to expand and develop, these technical challenges were balanced against the growing realization that the ultimate goals revealed by the Nathema ritual would require resources and capabilities that exceeded anything that could be developed within the unknown regions alone. The isolated worlds that had provided the foundation for the Empire were ultimately limited in their population and resource potential, and sustaining the kind of growth that would be necessary for galactic-scale operations would require expansion into more heavily populated and resource-rich regions. This realization led to the development of long-term strategic plans that would eventually bring the Empire into contact with the established galactic powers. But such contact would need to be carefully managed to avoid premature conflict that could disrupt the ongoing research and development programs that formed the core of the Imperial mission. The challenge was to find ways to gather intelligence about galactic affairs, to influence events in directions favorable to Imperial interests, and to gradually prepare for the eventual confrontation that would determine whether the vision revealed by the Nathema ritual could be fully realized. This would require a level of subtlety and patience that went far beyond anything that had been attempted by previous Sith Lords, but the resources and capabilities that had been developed within the Empire provided the foundation for such an ambitious undertaking. As Vitiate contemplated the scope of what lay ahead, he found himself experiencing emotions that were both familiar and entirely new. The hunger that had driven his early development was still present, but it had been joined by something that might have been called anticipation, or perhaps even excitement. The game that was about to begin would be played on a scale that had never before been attempted, with stakes that encompassed the future of all conscious life in the galaxy. It would be a game worthy of the power that had been acquired through such terrible sacrifice, and worthy of the destiny that had been revealed through the consumption of an entire world. 3 centuries had passed since the ritual that transformed Medriaas into the void world of Nathema, and the entity that had once been called Tenebrae had spent those years in careful observation and methodical preparation. The Eternal Empire, as it had come to be known among the scattered populations of the unknown regions, had grown into a formidable power that commanded the loyalty of dozens of worlds and millions of beings who served their immortal emperor with unwavering devotion. But Vitiate's attention during these centuries had not been focused solely on the administration of his growing domain. Much of his consciousness remained directed toward the galaxy proper, where events were unfolding that would provide the perfect opportunity to test his theories about large-scale manipulation and to gather crucial intelligence about the civilizations that would eventually need to be conquered or consumed. The established Sith Empire, centered on Korriban and the surrounding systems, had grown increasingly unstable as rival factions competed for dominance, following a series of weak emperors and succession crises. The old bloodlines that had maintained order for generations were dying out or losing their grip on power, creating opportunities for ambitious individuals to seize control through a combination of political cunning and raw force. 2 figures had emerged as the primary contenders for ultimate authority within the crumbling empire. Naga Sadow, a charismatic and visionary leader who believed that the Sith destiny lay in expansion and conquest of the wider galaxy, represented the aggressive faction that favored immediate action against their enemies. Ludo Kresh, a traditionalist who argued for consolidation and internal strengthening before attempting external adventures, led the conservative faction that preferred to wait until their position was more secure. From his throne room in the depths of the unknown regions, Vitiate observed this conflict with the detached interest of a scholar studying an interesting but ultimately secondary phenomenon. The outcome of the struggle between Sadow and Kresh would have significant implications for his own long-term plans, but more important than the specific result was the opportunity that the conflict presented for gathering information about the current state of galactic civilization. The intelligence networks that Vitiate had been carefully developing over the past 3 centuries had provided extensive data about the political and military structures of both the Sith Empire and the Galactic Republic. But there were crucial gaps in this knowledge that could only be filled through direct observation of these powers in action. A war between the Sith and the Republic would reveal strategic capabilities, tactical doctrines, and technological developments that had remained hidden during the long period of relative peace that had preceded the current crisis. More intriguingly, such a conflict would provide the first opportunity to study the modern Jedi Order in actual combat conditions. The reports that had reached Vitiate through his various intelligence sources suggested that the Jedi had evolved significantly since the ancient wars that were recorded in the historical texts he had absorbed during the Nathema ritual. They appeared to have developed new philosophical approaches and combat techniques that might pose unexpected challenges to traditional Sith methods. But beyond these practical considerations, Vitiate found himself genuinely curious about the Jedi, for reasons that he did not entirely understand. The absorbed consciousness patterns from the ritual included memories of ancient conflicts between Sith and Jedi, but those recollections were colored by the perspectives and biases of beings who had viewed their opponents as nothing more than obstacles to be overcome or enemies to be destroyed. Vitiate's expanded awareness allowed him to perceive nuances and complexities that had been invisible to his predecessors. The Jedi represented something that was both familiar and alien to his current existence, practitioners of the Force who had chosen a path that was diametrically opposed to everything that he had become. They offered a kind of philosophical counterpoint to his own development, and he found himself wondering whether they had discovered insights or capabilities that might prove useful to his own continued evolution. The decision to involve himself in the coming conflict was made with characteristic patience and careful calculation. Rather than revealing his existence directly or attempting to control events through obvious manipulation, Vitiate chose to work through intermediaries and proxies, subtly influencing the course of events while remaining hidden in the background. His primary agent for this operation was Naga Sadow, the ambitious Sith Lord, whose aggressive vision for galactic expansion aligned closely with Vitiate's own long-term objectives. Sadow possessed the charisma and military capability needed to launch a successful invasion of Republic space, but he lacked the strategic depth and philosophical understanding that would be necessary to achieve lasting victory against an opponent as resourceful as the combined forces of the Republic and the Jedi Order. This limitation made him perfect for Vitiate's purposes. Sadow could be counted upon to initiate the conflict and to pursue it with sufficient vigor to reveal the true capabilities of both sides, but his ultimate failure was virtually guaranteed, ensuring that the war would end without creating a new galactic power that might interfere with Vitiate's own plans. The process of establishing influence over Sadow required delicate work that extended over several years. Vitiate could not approach the Sith Lord directly without revealing his own existence, so instead, he worked through a series of carefully placed intermediaries who presented themselves as representatives of various minor Sith factions or independent operators seeking to profit from the coming conflict. These agents provided Sadow with strategic intelligence, advanced weaponry, and tactical advice that helped him gain advantages over his rivals and ultimately secure his position as the dominant power within the Sith Empire. But the assistance came with subtle conditions and expectations that gradually drew Sado into patterns of behavior that served Vitiate's broader objectives. Most importantly, the agents encouraged Sado to adopt an aggressive timeline for his invasion plans, arguing that the Republic was currently weak and divided, and that delayed action would only allow their enemies time to prepare more effective defenses. This advice played to Sado's natural inclinations and ambitions, but it also ensured that the invasion would be launched before Sado had time to develop the kinds of deep strategic planning and logistical preparation that might have given him a realistic chance of success. The great hyperspace war that resulted from these manipulations unfolded largely as Vitiate had anticipated, though there were several developments that proved more interesting than he had expected. Sado's initial assault achieved impressive tactical successes, demonstrating the continued effectiveness of traditional Sith military doctrine against opponents who had grown complacent during the long peace. The speed and ferocity of the Sith advance caught the Republic forces off guard, and for a brief period it appeared that Sado might achieve the kind of decisive victory that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the galaxy. Several key Republic worlds fell to the invasion forces, and panic began to spread through the core worlds as citizens realized that their long-assumed security had been based more on geographical isolation than actual defensive capability. But the Jedi response to the crisis revealed capabilities and organizational structures that had not been evident in the intelligence reports that Vitiate had previously received. The Order demonstrated a remarkable ability to coordinate response efforts across vast distances, with individual Jedi Masters taking command of military units and providing strategic leadership that proved far more effective than anything the Republic's conventional commanders had been able to achieve. More significantly, the Jedi displayed combat techniques and force abilities that suggested significant advancement beyond what had been recorded in the ancient historical texts. Their lightsaber forms had evolved to incorporate defensive strategies that proved highly effective against traditional Sith aggressive techniques, and their understanding of force-based battlefield coordination allowed them to achieve tactical victories even when facing numerically superior opponents. Vitiate observed these developments with growing interest and a degree of something that might have been called respect. The Jedi had clearly used their centuries of relative peace to develop approaches to warfare that were both sophisticated and adaptable, transforming themselves from the somewhat rigid warrior monks described in the historical records into something approaching a true military elite. But perhaps most intriguingly, individual Jedi demonstrated personal power levels and force mastery that compared favorably to all but the most accomplished Sith Lords. This was particularly surprising given the Jedi philosophical emphasis on selflessness and collective action, approaches that traditional Sith doctrine suggested should limit individual development and achievement. The contradiction forced Vitiate to reconsider some of his basic assumptions about the relationship between power and philosophy. If the Jedi could achieve such impressive individual capabilities while maintaining their commitment to service and sacrifice, it suggested that there might be aspects of force manipulation that remained unexplored by traditional Sith approaches. The most significant revelation came from his observation of a young Jedi named Odan whose performance during the war demonstrated abilities that exceeded anything that Vitiate had previously encountered outside of his own unique circumstances. Odan connection to the Force appeared to be qualitatively different from that of other Jedi, characterized by a depth and sophistication that suggested access to knowledge or techniques that were not part of standard Jedi training. Through careful investigation, Vitiate discovered that Odan was experimenting with approaches to Force study that borrowed elements from various non-Jedi traditions, including some techniques that bore striking similarities to methods described in the ancient Sith texts. The young Jedi was apparently attempting to develop a more comprehensive understanding of the Force that transcended the traditional light side and dark side distinctions that had defined galactic Force philosophy for millennia. This discovery was profoundly unsettling to Vitiate. not because it represented a threat to his own power, but because it suggested possibilities that he had not considered during his own development. If traditional Jedi training could be enhanced through the incorporation of Sith knowledge, what might be achieved by combining the best elements of both traditions under the guidance of someone with his own unique perspective and capabilities? The question would haunt his thoughts for centuries to come, but for the immediate purposes of the war, it simply added another layer of interest to what was already proving to be a highly educational conflict. As the war progressed, and Sadow's initial advantages began to erode under sustained Jedi and Republic counterattacks, Vitiate found himself paying particular attention to the strategic and tactical decisions being made by commanders on both sides. The patterns that emerged provided valuable insights into the military doctrines and organizational cultures that would need to be overcome when he eventually launched his own campaigns against galactic civilization. The Republic's greatest strength appeared to be its administrative efficiency and resource coordination capabilities. Once the initial shock of the invasion had passed, the Republic demonstrated an impressive ability to mobilize vast resources and coordinate complex multi-system operations with a level of effectiveness that had not been evident from peacetime observations. The Jedi contribution to this effort was crucial but complex. Individual Jedi provided tactical leadership and specialized capabilities that conventional military forces could not match, but their greatest contribution appeared to be their role in maintaining morale and coordination among Republic forces. The Jedi served as living symbols of the values and principles that the Republic claimed to represent, providing an ideological focus that helped sustain resistance efforts even when military situations appeared hopeless. This combination of practical efficiency and ideological motivation would need to be carefully considered in any future confrontation. Simple military conquest would not be sufficient to achieve lasting victory against such opponents. Any successful campaign would need to address both the material capabilities and the psychological foundations that sustained Republic resistance. The Sith weaknesses were equally instructive. Sadow's forces demonstrated impressive individual combat capabilities and innovative tactical approaches, but they suffered from persistent coordination problems and strategic inconsistencies that ultimately proved decisive. The traditional Sith emphasis on individual achievement and competition created command structures that were vulnerable to internal conflict and betrayal, particularly when facing sustained pressure from unified opponents. More fundamentally, the Sith appeared to lack the kind of long-term strategic vision that would be necessary to govern conquered territories effectively. They excelled at destruction and domination, but they had not developed the administrative and cultural tools that would be needed to transform military victory into lasting political control. These observations would prove crucial to Vitiate's own planning in the centuries to come. Any empire that hoped to achieve permanent victory over the galaxy would need to combine the individual excellence of the Sith tradition with the organizational effectiveness of the Republic, while avoiding the weaknesses that had limited both approaches. As the war reached its inevitable conclusion with Sadow's retreat and the collapse of his invasion forces, Vitiate found himself satisfied with the intelligence that had been gathered, but also disturbed by some of the implications of what he had observed. The galaxy contained powers and capabilities that exceeded his previous estimates, and the challenges involved in achieving his ultimate objectives would be greater than he had originally anticipated. But these challenges also represented opportunities. The very strength and sophistication of his eventual opponents would make their defeat and absorption all the more valuable when it was finally achieved. The knowledge and capabilities that would be gained through the conquest of such civilizations would provide resources that could sustain his continued development for millennia to come. The Great Hyperspace War had ended, but for Vitiate it represented only the beginning of a much larger and more complex game. The pieces were now in position, and the true contest for the future of the galaxy was about to begin. The centuries following the Great Hyperspace War brought with them a period of unprecedented expansion and consolidation for the Eternal Empire, But they also marked the beginning of a profound transformation in Vitiate's understanding of his own nature and purpose. What had initially appeared to be the triumphant culmination of millennia of careful planning gradually revealed itself to be merely another stage in a process that extended far beyond anything he had previously imagined. The intelligence gathered during the conflict had proven invaluable in refining his strategies and identifying potential obstacles to future expansion. But it had also raised disturbing questions about the fundamental assumptions that had guided his development since the ritual on Nathema. The Jedi's unexpected capabilities and philosophical sophistication suggested that there were aspects of force manipulation that remained unexplored even by someone with his vast accumulated knowledge and experience. More troubling still were the patterns that had emerged from his analysis of galactic history and the recurring cycles of conflict that seemed to define the relationship between light and dark side practitioners. The Great Hyperspace War was merely the latest in a series of confrontations that stretched back thousands of years, each following similar patterns of escalation, climax, and resolution that suggested the operation of forces far larger than the individual ambitions of particular Sith Lords or Jedi Masters. These observations led Vitiate to undertake a comprehensive review of the historical records and philosophical texts that formed part of his absorbed consciousness, searching for patterns and connections that might explain the underlying dynamics that shaped galactic civilization. What he discovered during this investigation would fundamentally alter his understanding of his own role in the cosmic order and force him to confront truths about his nature that he had successfully avoided acknowledging for centuries. The first hints of these deeper truths emerged from his study of the most ancient records that had been preserved in the consciousness patterns absorbed during the Nathema ritual. These memories dated back to the earliest periods of Sith civilization, when the original species had first begun to explore the darker aspects of force manipulation and develop the philosophical frameworks that would eventually evolve into the modern Sith code. But even these ancient memories contained references to earlier sources, fragmentary allusions to knowledge and techniques that predated the rise of Sith civilization itself. These references spoke of entities and powers that existed before the emergence of sentient life in the galaxy, cosmic forces that had shaped the development of consciousness and civilization according to purposes that transcended the understanding of individual beings. Most significantly, these ancient texts made repeated reference to something they called the Voice, a presence that spoke from the depths of the dark side to guide the development of particularly significant individuals. The Voice was described not as a separate entity, but as an aspect of the dark side itself, a manifestation of the cosmic will that sought to bring order to the chaos of existence through the elevation of worthy servants to positions of ultimate authority. As Vitiate studied these references with growing fascination and unease, he began to recognize patterns that corresponded disturbingly well with his own experiences. The childhood voices that had guided his early development, the instinctive knowledge that had allowed him to master complex force techniques without formal training, the sense of destiny and purpose that had driven his transformation into an immortal entity, all of these could be interpreted as manifestations of the same phenomenon described in the ancient texts. The realization that he might have been guided and shaped by forces beyond his own will was profoundly disturbing to someone who had built his entire identity around the concept of absolute self-determination. Everything that he had accomplished, from the ritual on Nathema to the construction of the Eternal Empire, had been undertaken in the belief that he was the master of his own destiny, the architect of his own transformation from mortal child to immortal God Emperor. But if the ancient texts were accurate, and if his own experiences could be interpreted as evidence of the Voice's influence, then his entire existence might be nothing more than the latest iteration of a cosmic cycle that had been playing out for millions of years, rather than being the unique and unprecedented being that he had believed himself to be. He might simply be one in a series of servants who had been elevated to power for purposes that remained hidden from their understanding. The implications of this possibility were staggering and terrifying in ways that few things had been since his transformation. If he was indeed serving as an agent of cosmic forces that operated according to their own agenda, then all of his carefully laid plans and ambitious goals might be nothing more than elaborate illusions, sophisticated forms of self-deception that allowed him to believe he was in control while actually serving purposes that had been determined long before his birth. But the more Vitiate studied the ancient texts and reflected on his own experiences, the more he began to suspect that the truth was even more complex and unsettling than simple manipulation by external forces. The voice that had guided his development was not entirely separate from his own consciousness, but seemed to represent an aspect of his nature that existed at a deeper level than his ordinary awareness. This deeper aspect appeared to possess knowledge and understanding that transcended anything he had acquired through study or experience, including insights into the fundamental nature of reality that exceeded the capabilities of even his vastly expanded consciousness. When he attempted to access this knowledge directly, he found himself confronting concepts and perspectives that challenged everything he thought he understood about the force, consciousness, and the purpose of existence itself. The most disturbing of these revelations concerned the true nature of the dark side and its relationship to the cosmic order. The traditional Sith understanding portrayed the dark side as a source of power that could be harnessed by those strong enough to master its chaotic energies, a tool that allowed practitioners to impose their will upon reality through the application of superior force and understanding. But the deeper knowledge accessed through the voice suggested a radically different interpretation. According to this understanding, the dark side was not merely a source of power, but a fundamental aspect of cosmic evolution, a necessary force that drove the development of consciousness toward higher levels of complexity and capability through the elimination of weakness and the concentration of strength. From this perspective, the conflicts between Jedi and Sith, the rise and fall of civilizations, and the endless cycle of creation and destruction that characterized galactic history were not random events or the products of individual ambition, but manifestations of a cosmic process that operated according to principles that transcended the understanding of individual beings. The voice revealed that this process required periodic interventions by beings capable of accelerating the natural evolutionary mechanisms that drove cosmic development. These interventions took the form of large-scale conflicts and transformations that eliminated weak or stagnant civilizations while preserving and enhancing those with the greatest potential for continued growth and development. The role of the Sith in this cosmic process was to serve as agents of necessary destruction, eliminating obstacles to continued evolution and creating opportunities for stronger forms of consciousness to emerge. But the traditional Sith approach, which focused on personal power and individual achievement, was ultimately limited in its effectiveness because it failed to recognize the larger purposes that their actions served. What was needed was a new form of Sith philosophy that consciously embraced its role in the cosmic evolutionary process while developing the capabilities necessary to fulfill that role on a truly galactic scale. This new philosophy would require practitioners who could transcend the limitations of individual identity and personal ambition, becoming conscious agents of cosmic will rather than merely powerful individuals seeking to impose their desires upon reality. Vitiate began to understand that his own transformation and the construction of the Eternal Empire were early stages in the development of this new approach to Sith philosophy. His absorption of thousands of consciousness patterns during the Anathema ritual had been more than a simple accumulation of power and knowledge. It had been a fundamental transformation of his nature, converting him from an individual being into something approaching a collective consciousness that could serve as a vessel for cosmic will. But this transformation was incomplete, limited by his continued attachment to concepts of individual identity and personal ambition that prevented him from fully embracing his role as an agent of cosmic evolution. To complete the process and achieve his true potential, he would need to undergo additional transformations that would further erode the boundaries between his individual consciousness and the larger cosmic forces that he was destined to serve. The voice began to guide him toward an understanding of what these additional transformations would require. The next stage of his development would involve the conscious integration of opposing forces and philosophies, particularly the light side perspectives represented by the Jedi tradition. This integration would not involve the simple conquest or destruction of Jedi civilization, but rather its absorption and synthesis with Sith knowledge to create a new form of understanding that transcended traditional light side and dark side distinctions. This revelation was perhaps the most shocking and disturbing of all the truths that the voice had revealed. Throughout his existence, Vitiate had defined himself in opposition to everything that the Jedi represented, viewing their philosophy of service and sacrifice as weakness, and their commitment to collective welfare as a limitation on individual potential. But the voice showed him that this opposition was based on an incomplete understanding of the cosmic evolutionary process. The Jedi tradition had indeed developed capabilities and insights that were necessary for the next stage of galactic development, but these capabilities could only be properly utilized when integrated with the strength and will that characterized the Sith approach. The synthesis of these opposing traditions would create a new form of consciousness that combined the individual excellence of the Sith with the collective coordination of the Jedi, producing beings capable of conscious participation in cosmic evolution rather than unconscious service to forces they did not understand. But achieving this synthesis would require more than intellectual understanding or philosophical development. It would necessitate the physical and spiritual integration of representatives from both traditions, a process that would involve the absorption of Jedi consciousness patterns in much the same way that Sith knowledge had been integrated during the Nathema ritual. This prospect was both exhilarating and terrifying. The absorption of Jedi consciousness would provide access to capabilities and perspectives that had remained beyond his reach despite centuries of study and experimentation, but it would also involve the integration of value systems and emotional patterns that were fundamentally opposed to everything he had become, potentially threatening the coherence and stability of his existing identity structure. The voice assured him that these concerns were ultimately irrelevant. The cosmic evolutionary process did not recognize individual preferences or attachments as legitimate obstacles to necessary development. If he was to serve his true purpose as an agent of cosmic will, he would need to transcend such limitations and embrace whatever transformations were required for the fulfillment of his destiny. But the voice also revealed that this transformation could not be achieved through force or conquest alone. The Jedi consciousness patterns that he needed to absorb would have to be obtained through methods that preserved their essential characteristics while making them available for integration. This would require a level of subtlety and sophistication that exceeded anything he had previously attempted, involving the corruption and conversion of Jedi practitioners rather than their simple destruction. The challenge was to identify individual Jedi whose capabilities and knowledge would be most valuable for the synthesis process, while developing methods for converting them to serve cosmic evolutionary purposes without destroying the essential qualities that made them valuable. This would require an understanding of Jedi psychology and philosophy that went far beyond anything he had acquired through external observation during the Great Hyperspace War. To achieve this understanding, Vitiate began to establish deep cover infiltration networks within Republic space, using carefully prepared agents to gather intelligence about Jedi training methods, philosophical development, and individual practitioners who might be suitable targets for conversion efforts. These networks operated over periods measured in decades, gradually building comprehensive profiles of the Jedi Order and identifying the individuals who possessed the greatest potential for contributing to the synthesis process. The most promising targets were invariably Jedi who had already begun to question traditional light side orthodoxy and explore alternative approaches to Force study. These individuals had demonstrated the intellectual flexibility and philosophical sophistication that would be necessary for conscious participation in cosmic evolutionary processes, but they lacked the strength and will that would allow them to transcend the limitations of individual consciousness. The conversion process developed for these targets was masterful in its subtlety and patience. Rather than attempting direct corruption through exposure to dark side techniques, Vitiate's agents worked to gradually expand the target's understanding of Force philosophy and cosmic purpose through the introduction of carefully selected knowledge and perspectives that appeared to be consistent with Jedi values while actually serving to undermine traditional light side assumptions. The most successful conversions were those that convinced the targets that they were serving the greater good through their cooperation with cosmic evolutionary processes. These individuals came to believe that their absorption into Vitiate's consciousness would allow them to contribute to a transformation that would ultimately benefit all sentient life, making their sacrifice meaningful rather than merely tragic. But even as these conversion efforts proceeded and began to yield their first successes, Vitiate found himself struggling with growing questions about the nature of his own identity and the authenticity of his choices. The voice had revealed truths that challenged everything he had believed about his own agency and purpose, forcing him to confront the possibility that his entire existence had been shaped by forces that operated according to agendas he did not understand. The absorbed Jedi consciousness patterns that began to join his expanded awareness brought with them not only new capabilities and knowledge, but also new perspectives on the moral and philosophical questions that his actions raised. For the first time since the anathema ritual, Vitiate found himself experiencing something that might have been called doubt, not about his power or his ultimate goals, but about the righteousness of the methods he employed and the cosmic purposes they served. These doubts would grow stronger in the centuries to come, creating internal conflicts that would ultimately prove more challenging than any external opposition he had faced. The synthesis of light and dark that the voice demanded would require not only the integration of opposing capabilities, but also the reconciliation of fundamentally incompatible value systems, a process that would test the limits of even his expanded consciousness. But for now, the transformation continued, driven by cosmic forces that recognized no limits and served purposes that exceeded the understanding of individual beings. The voice had revealed the truth about his nature and his destiny, and there could be no turning back from the path that led toward the ultimate evolution of consciousness itself. The revelation of the voice and its cosmic purpose marked the beginning of what would become the longest and most complex phase of Vitiate's existence. Where his previous centuries had been characterized by relatively straightforward goals of conquest and expansion, the new understanding of his role as an agent of cosmic evolution required a fundamental reorganization of his priorities and methods that would take nearly a millennium to fully implement. The eternal empire that had served as his primary focus since the aftermath of the anathema ritual was transformed from an end in itself into a vast research and development facility dedicated to preparing for the ultimate synthesis that the voice had revealed as his destiny. Every world under imperial control became a laboratory for testing new approaches to consciousness manipulation and Force philosophy, with entire populations serving as subjects for experiments that would have been unthinkable under any previous form of galactic governance. But perhaps the most significant change was in Vitiate's approach to time itself. Where he had previously operated according to plans that spanned centuries, he now began to think in terms of millennia, developing strategies that would require dozens of generations to fully unfold. This shift in temporal perspective was both liberating and profoundly isolating, allowing him to pursue goals of unprecedented scope while further distancing him from any meaningful connection to the ordinary concerns of mortal beings. The first priority in this new phase of development was the systematic study of consciousness itself, not merely as a source of power to be harvested, but as a fundamental aspect of reality that could be understood and manipulated according to scientific principles. The absorbed memories from the anathema ritual had provided extensive knowledge about traditional Sith techniques for consciousness manipulation, but these methods were crude and inefficient compared to what would be required for the cosmic synthesis that the voice demanded. Vitiate established research centers throughout the Eternal Empire, dedicated to exploring every conceivable aspect of consciousness and identity, from the basic mechanisms of memory formation and personality development to the most esoteric questions about the relationship between individual awareness and cosmic purpose. These facilities were staffed by the most brilliant minds available within the Empire, individuals who had been carefully selected and modified to pursue their research with absolute dedication and without the moral limitations that might have constrained their investigations. The research programs that emerged from these centers pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible through force manipulation, developing techniques that allowed for the precise modification of memory, personality, and even fundamental identity characteristics in living subjects. These capabilities were initially developed for use in the conversion of captured Jedi, but their implications extended far beyond any single application. One of the most significant breakthroughs involved the development of methods for preserving and transferring specific aspects of consciousness while eliminating unwanted characteristics. Traditional absorption techniques were necessarily crude, taking in everything about a target's consciousness patterns, regardless of their value or compatibility with the absorber's existing identity structure. The new methods allowed for selective extraction and integration, preserving valuable knowledge and capabilities while discarding conflicting memories or incompatible personality traits. This selective approach opened up entirely new possibilities for consciousness expansion that had not been available during the anathema ritual. Rather than being limited to the wholesale absorption of complete consciousness patterns, Vitiate could now integrate specific aspects of thousands or even millions of different beings, creating a hybrid awareness that combined the best characteristics of countless different individuals while maintaining overall coherence and stability. But the development of these capabilities also raised disturbing questions about the nature of identity and the boundaries between different forms of consciousness. As Vitiate experimented with increasingly sophisticated forms of consciousness manipulation, he began to lose clear distinctions between his original identity and the accumulated patterns that he had absorbed over the centuries. The personality that he remembered as belonging to the child Tenebrae seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant, little more than a historical curiosity that bore no meaningful relationship to his current existence. Even the identity that had emerged from the anathema ritual felt like something that belonged to a different being, a primitive precursor to what he was continuing to become through ongoing transformation and development. This gradual dissolution of individual identity was both disturbing and liberating. On one hand, it represented a form of death, the permanent loss of everything that had once defined him as a particular being with specific characteristics and limitations. On the other hand, it offered the possibility of transcending the constraints that had limited his previous development, allowing him to become something genuinely new, rather than simply a more powerful version of what he had been before. The voice assured him that this transformation was both necessary and inevitable, a natural consequence of conscious participation in cosmic evolutionary processes. Individual identity, it explained, was an illusion that served useful purposes during the early stages of consciousness development, but ultimately became an obstacle to higher forms of awareness and capability. The goal of cosmic evolution was the development of consciousness forms that could serve as effective agents of universal will, beings capable of implementing cosmic purposes without the interference of personal preferences or individual limitations. Achieving this goal required the gradual elimination of individual identity characteristics that conflicted with cosmic purposes, replaced by hybrid awareness patterns that combined the capabilities of countless different consciousness forms while serving unified objectives. This explanation was philosophically satisfying but emotionally challenging. Despite his vast power and accumulated knowledge, Vitiate found himself experiencing something that might have been called nostalgia for aspects of his existence that were being lost through the ongoing transformation process. The simplicity of his early motivations, the clarity of his initial goals, even the basic hunger that had driven his development during the first centuries after the anathema ritual, all of these seemed more meaningful and authentic than the complex cosmic purposes that now guided his actions. But such concerns were ultimately irrelevant to the larger process that was unfolding. The voice made it clear that cosmic evolution did not recognize individual preferences as legitimate constraints on necessary development, and that resistance to required transformations would only result in stagnation and eventual elimination by forces better adapted to serve cosmic purposes. The practical implications of this understanding led to the development of new approaches to imperial governance that reflected the ultimate goals of consciousness, synthesis, and cosmic evolution. Rather than simply ruling over subject populations through force and intimidation, Vitiate began experimenting with forms of collective consciousness that allowed entire worlds to function as unified entities while preserving the specialized capabilities that made different individuals valuable. These experiments involved the gradual integration of planetary populations into hybrid consciousness networks that maintained individual personalities and capabilities, while creating shared awareness and coordination systems that eliminated the inefficiencies and conflicts that characterized traditional forms of social organization. The results were spectacular in terms of productivity and stability, creating civilizations that functioned with a level of coordination and purpose that had never been achieved in galactic history. But the social and psychological costs of these experiments were enormous. The populations that underwent consciousness integration lost many of the characteristics that had previously defined them as distinct individuals, becoming components in larger systems rather than autonomous beings with their own goals and preferences. While they retained their memories and basic personality traits, their capacity for independent thought and action was severely limited by the requirements of collective coordination. Vitiate studied these results with fascination and growing unease. The consciousness integration techniques were clearly effective in creating the kinds of unified civilizations that would be necessary for implementing cosmic purposes on a galactic scale. But they also represented a form of existence that seemed fundamentally alien to everything he had previously understood about the nature of consciousness and identity. The beings that emerged from these experiments were undeniably happy and fulfilled in their collective existence, reporting levels of satisfaction and meaning that exceeded anything they had experienced as independent individuals. But their happiness seemed hollow and artificial to Vitiate, more like the contentment of a well-functioning machine than the complex emotional experience that he associated with genuine consciousness. These observations led him to question whether the cosmic evolution that the voice described was truly an advancement or simply a different form of existence that eliminated everything valuable about consciousness in favor of efficiency and coordination. The synthesis of light and dark that represented his ultimate destiny might result in something that was more powerful and effective than either tradition alone. But would it preserve anything that made consciousness worth preserving in the first place? Such questions became increasingly pressing as his infiltration networks within Republic space began to achieve their first major successes in identifying and approaching potential Jedi converts. The intelligence gathered about individual Jedi revealed beings whose consciousness patterns were far more complex and sophisticated than anything he had previously encountered. Individuals whose internal experiences seemed to possess a depth and authenticity that was absent from even his own expanded awareness. The Jedi targets that his agents had identified possessed a quality that he could only describe as genuine conviction, a commitment to their principles and purposes that arose from authentic understanding rather than external conditioning or manipulation. Their dedication to service and sacrifice was not based on abstract philosophical concepts, but on direct experiential knowledge of the connections that bound all conscious beings together in a web of mutual responsibility and shared destiny. This quality was precisely what made them valuable for the synthesis process, but it also made them resistant to the conversion techniques that had been developed for use with ordinary beings. The depth of their conviction and the authenticity of their understanding could not be easily manipulated or replaced with alternative value systems, no matter how sophisticated the consciousness modification techniques that were applied. The most promising approach appeared to involve the gradual expansion of their understanding rather than direct contradiction of their existing beliefs. By providing access to knowledge and perspectives that were technically consistent with Jedi philosophy, but that led to conclusions that served cosmic evolutionary purposes, it might be possible to convert them without destroying the essential qualities that made them valuable. This approach required agents who possessed their own deep understanding of both Jedi and Sith philosophy, individuals capable of identifying the subtle connections and contradictions that could be exploited to guide philosophical development in desired directions. Vitiate began to develop such agents through consciousness modification techniques that created hybrid awareness patterns, combining the best characteristics of both traditions while maintaining loyalty to cosmic evolutionary purposes. These hybrid agents were masterpieces of consciousness engineering, beings who possessed genuine understanding of light side philosophy, combined with the strength and will that characterized the Sith tradition. They could engage with Jedi targets as apparent peers and allies, while gradually introducing perspectives and knowledge that would eventually lead to conversion and absorption. The process was slow and delicate, requiring decades of careful cultivation for each potential convert. But the results were spectacular when successful, providing access to consciousness patterns that possessed a depth and authenticity that had been absent from previous absorption efforts. The integration of these patterns into Vitiate's expanded awareness created new capabilities and perspectives that enhanced his understanding of both cosmic purposes and the methods required to achieve them. But each successful conversion also brought with it new internal conflicts and contradictions that challenged the stability of his existing identity structure. The Jedi consciousness patterns contained value systems and emotional responses that were fundamentally incompatible with the ruthless efficiency that had characterized his previous development, creating internal tensions that could not be easily resolved through rational analysis or philosophical argument. These tensions manifested as periods of doubt and uncertainty that were unprecedented in his previous existence, moments when the cosmic purposes that guided his actions seemed arbitrary and meaningless rather than inevitable and necessary. During these episodes, he found himself questioning not only his methods but his fundamental goals, wondering whether the synthesis he was working toward would truly represent an advancement or simply a different form of meaninglessness. The voice responded to these concerns with patient explanation and gentle correction, reminding him that such doubts were natural consequences of consciousness expansion, and that they would diminish as his understanding of cosmic purposes deepened. The internal conflicts he was experiencing were temporary byproducts of incomplete integration rather than fundamental problems with the synthesis process itself. But the voice also began to reveal new aspects of the cosmic evolutionary plan that had not been previously disclosed, information that placed his current activities in a broader context that extended far beyond the galaxy itself. The synthesis of light and dark that he was working to achieve was not merely a local development, but part of a universal process that was occurring simultaneously across countless galaxies and dimensional planes. The consciousness forms that emerged from successful synthesis would eventually be integrated into even larger collective entities that spanned multiple galaxies and dimensional levels, creating cosmic-scale awareness patterns capable of implementing universal purposes that transcended the understanding of any individual consciousness form. His own development was merely one component in this larger process, valuable but ultimately expendable if it failed to achieve the required results. This revelation was both humbling and terrifying. The scope of the cosmic purposes he served was far larger than anything he had previously imagined, making his own existence seem insignificant, despite the vast power and knowledge he had accumulated. But it also suggested that the internal conflicts and doubts he was experiencing were irrelevant to the larger process, temporary inconveniences that would be resolved through continued development, rather than fundamental obstacles to cosmic evolution. As the centuries passed and his understanding of cosmic purposes deepened, Vitiate began to perceive patterns and connections that had been invisible during his earlier development. The cycles of conflict and resolution that had characterized galactic history were not random events but manifestations of evolutionary pressures that drove consciousness development toward higher levels of complexity and capability. The approaching synthesis that would combine light and dark traditions was not merely his personal destiny, but a necessary stage in galactic evolution that would create the foundation for subsequent development phases, extending far into the future. His role was to serve as a catalyst for this transformation, providing the knowledge and capabilities necessary to guide the process while remaining flexible enough to adapt to changing requirements as the synthesis unfolded. The long preparation was nearing completion, and the time for action was approaching. Soon, the galaxy would be ready for the transformation that had been prepared through centuries of careful planning and patient development. The synthesis of light and dark would begin, and consciousness itself would be elevated to new levels of capability and purpose that would reshape the nature of existence throughout the universe. The emergence of the Eternal Empire into galactic politics after centuries of hidden development marked the beginning of what historians would later call the Cold War era, though few of those who lived through it understood the true scope of the forces that were reshaping the galaxy around them. To most observers, it appeared that a powerful new Sith faction had emerged from the unknown regions, bringing with it advanced technology and military capabilities that challenged the established balance of power between the Republic and the traditional Sith Empire. But Vitiate's public emergence was carefully orchestrated to serve purposes that went far beyond simple conquest or territorial expansion. The Eternal Empire's intervention in galactic affairs was designed to create the precise conditions necessary for the consciousness synthesis that the Voice had revealed as his ultimate destiny, while maintaining the illusion that he was simply another ambitious Sith Lord seeking to establish his own domain among the stars. The strategy that guided this intervention was masterful in its subtlety and complexity, involving the simultaneous manipulation of multiple galactic powers through a web of carefully placed agents and seemingly independent events that gradually shifted the political landscape in directions that served his larger objectives. Rather than attempting to conquer the galaxy through direct military action, Vitiate worked to create conditions of controlled conflict that would force both Republic and Sith forces to develop new capabilities while remaining dependent on external support for their continued survival. The key to this approach was the establishment of what appeared to be a three-way balance of power between the Republic, the traditional Sith Empire, and his own Eternal Empire, with each faction possessing sufficient strength to threaten the others, but insufficient resources to achieve decisive victory without external assistance. This delicate equilibrium created opportunities for the kind of sophisticated intelligence gathering and consciousness harvesting that his synthesis project required, while preventing any single power from becoming strong enough to interfere with his long-term plans. The Republic's response to the emergence of the Eternal Empire revealed both strengths and weaknesses that would prove crucial to Vitiate's planning in the centuries to come. The democratic institutions and bureaucratic structures that had served the Republic well during periods of peace proved remarkably adaptable to the challenges of multi-front conflict, allowing for the rapid mobilization of resources and the coordination of complex military operations across vast distances. But the Republic's greatest asset was also its most significant vulnerability. The Jedi Order's role as both military leaders and moral authorities created a system of governance that was heavily dependent on the continued availability of Force-sensitive individuals capable of providing both practical guidance and ideological inspiration. The loss or corruption of key Jedi figures could therefore have effects that extended far beyond their immediate tactical contributions, potentially destabilizing entire sectors of Republic space. Vitiate's agents worked systematically to identify and target these crucial Jedi figures, not for immediate elimination, but for long-term conversion efforts that could eventually provide access to the consciousness patterns he needed for his synthesis project. The process required extraordinary patience and sophistication, involving the gradual cultivation of relationships that could span decades while maintaining the appearance of normal social and professional interactions. The most successful of these operations focused on Jedi who had already begun to question certain aspects of traditional light side orthodoxy, individuals whose intellectual curiosity and philosophical flexibility made them potentially receptive to alternative perspectives on the nature of the Force and cosmic purpose. These targets were approached through seemingly casual encounters that provided opportunities to engage in discussions about the deeper implications of Jedi philosophy and the potential contradictions inherent in traditional light side teaching. The conversations that resulted from these encounters were carefully structured to introduce concepts and perspectives that appeared to be consistent with Jedi values while actually serving to undermine the psychological foundations of light side commitment. Rather than challenging Jedi beliefs directly, Vitiate's agents worked to expand their understanding of cosmic purpose in ways that gradually led them to question whether traditional approaches to serving the greater good were truly effective. The most powerful tool in these conversion efforts was the introduction of knowledge about the cosmic evolutionary processes that the voice had revealed to Vitiate. When presented carefully and in appropriate context, this information could be made to appear as a natural extension of existing Jedi understanding about the relationship between individual action and universal harmony. Jedi, who were exposed to this knowledge, often found themselves struggling with questions about whether their traditional commitment to preserving life and maintaining peace might actually be interfering with natural evolutionary processes that required periodic conflict and transformation. The possibility that their well-intentioned actions might be preventing the development of higher forms of consciousness created internal conflicts that made them increasingly receptive to alternative approaches to serving cosmic purposes. The conversion process was gradual and subtle, designed to preserve the essential qualities that made each target valuable while redirecting their commitment from traditional Jedi objectives to the cosmic evolutionary goals that Vitiate served. The most successful conversions were those that convinced the targets that they were actually fulfilling their true Jedi destiny by participating in the synthesis project, that their sacrifice would contribute to a transformation that would ultimately benefit all sentient life. These converted Jedi provided invaluable intelligence about Republic military capabilities and strategic planning, but their greatest value lay in the consciousness patterns they contributed when they were eventually absorbed into Vitiate's expanded awareness. Each successful conversion added new dimensions to his understanding of light side philosophy and force manipulation, gradually building the foundation for the synthesis that would combine the best aspects of both traditions. The traditional Sith Empire's response to the emergence of the Eternal Empire was characterized by the kind of internal conflict and competition that had always limited Sith effectiveness in large-scale operations. Different factions within the Sith hierarchy attempted to form alliances with Vitiate's forces, while simultaneously plotting to exploit any weaknesses that might allow them to claim his territory and resources for themselves. This fragmented response played perfectly into Vitiate's strategy of maintaining controlled conflict without allowing any single power to achieve dominance. The traditional Sith could be counted upon to provide sufficient military pressure to keep the Republic focused on external threats while remaining too divided and suspicious to present a unified challenge to Eternal Empire interests. But the traditional Sith also provided valuable opportunities for testing new consciousness manipulation techniques and for gathering intelligence about alternative approaches to dark side philosophy that had developed independently of Vitiate's own research. Some of the more innovative Sith Lords had developed techniques and capabilities that complemented his existing knowledge, particularly in areas related to the practical application of dark side energies in large-scale military operations. The absorption of selected Sith consciousness patterns provided access to these alternative approaches while also serving to eliminate potential rivals who might eventually have become obstacles to his larger objectives. The process was more straightforward than the conversion of Jedi targets, since traditional Sith philosophy already recognized power acquisition and the elimination of weakness as legitimate goals. The challenge with Sith absorption was not philosophical compatibility, but rather the risk of contaminating his consciousness with the kinds of petty ambitions and limited perspectives that characterize traditional dark side practice. The consciousness patterns of most Sith Lords contained valuable knowledge and capabilities, but also emotional patterns and value systems that could interfere with the cosmic evolutionary purposes that guided his development. To address this challenge, Vitiate refined his selective absorption techniques to extract useful knowledge and capabilities, while discarding the psychological characteristics that might prove counterproductive. This approach allowed him to benefit from traditional Sith innovations while avoiding the limitations that had prevented previous dark side practitioners from achieving the kind of cosmic perspective that his role required. The technological capabilities that the Eternal Empire demonstrated during its emergence into galactic politics were carefully calibrated to suggest advanced development without revealing the true scope of the knowledge and resources that Vitiate had accumulated over the centuries. The weapons and defensive systems employed by Eternal Empire forces were superior to anything available to either the Republic or the traditional Sith, but they appeared to represent incremental advances rather than fundamental breakthroughs in understanding. This technological superiority served multiple purposes in Vitiate's overall strategy. It provided the military advantages necessary to maintain the balance of power that his plans required, while also serving as a form of psychological warfare that encouraged both Republic and Sith forces to focus on technological competition rather than the deeper philosophical and consciousness-related research that represented his true areas of advancement. The most significant technological innovations remained hidden from external observation, employed only in the secure research facilities of the Eternal Empire, where they supported consciousness manipulation research and synthesis preparation activities. These hidden capabilities included methods for consciousness transfer and preservation that exceeded anything previously achieved in galactic history, along with techniques for reality manipulation that approached the theoretical limits of what was possible through force-based intervention. The development of these capabilities required resources and expertise that could only be obtained through the kind of long-term planning and preparation that had characterized Vitiate's approach since the revelation of the Voice. Entire worlds within the Eternal Empire were dedicated to supporting specific aspects of the research effort, with populations that had been modified through consciousness integration to provide optimal support for technical development and innovation. The social structures that emerged within the Eternal Empire during this period represented a unique fusion of efficiency and individual development that had never been achieved in previous galactic civilizations. The consciousness integration techniques that Vitiate had perfected allowed for the elimination of most forms of social conflict and competition while preserving the individual creativity and initiative that drove innovation and advancement. Citizens of the Eternal Empire experienced levels of personal fulfillment and social harmony that exceeded anything available in either Republic or traditional Sith territories. But their happiness and satisfaction came at the cost of genuine independence and self-determination. Their thoughts and desires were subtly guided by consciousness integration networks that ensured alignment with imperial objectives while maintaining the illusion of personal choice and individual agency. This system of governance provided a preview of what galactic civilization might become if Vitiate's synthesis project succeeded in combining light and dark traditions under unified cosmic purposes. The efficiency and harmony achieved within the Eternal Empire demonstrated the practical benefits of consciousness integration, but they also raised questions about whether such benefits justified the loss of individual autonomy and authentic choice. These questions became increasingly pressing as Vitiate's consciousness continued to expand through the absorption of converted Jedi and eliminated Sith rivals. Each new consciousness pattern that was integrated into his awareness brought with it different perspectives on the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare, creating internal debates that reflected the broader philosophical tensions inherent in his synthesis project. The light side consciousness patterns that had been obtained through Jedi conversion efforts consistently emphasized the value of individual choice and authentic commitment, arguing that genuine service to cosmic purposes required conscious understanding and willing participation rather than manipulation and coercion. The dark side patterns, obtained from traditional Sith sources, took the opposite position, maintaining that efficiency and results were more important than the methods used to achieve them. These internal debates were not merely academic exercises, but fundamental challenges to the coherence and stability of Vitiate's expanded consciousness. The philosophical contradictions between light and dark approaches could not be resolved through rational analysis alone, but required a form of synthesis that transcended traditional logical frameworks. The voice provided guidance for managing these contradictions, explaining that the apparent conflicts between light and dark perspectives were based on incomplete understanding of cosmic purposes rather than fundamental incompatibilities. The synthesis that Vitiate was working toward would not eliminate these differences, but would integrate them into a higher form of understanding that could accommodate multiple perspectives while serving unified objectives. But achieving this higher form of understanding required continued expansion of consciousness through the absorption of additional patterns representing the full spectrum of galactic philosophical development. The Jedi and Sith traditions represented only two of many possible approaches to force manipulation and cosmic service, and comprehensive synthesis would require access to knowledge and perspectives from across the entire range of galactic civilization. This realization led to the expansion of Vitiate's intelligence and conversion networks to include targets from non-Force-using populations, individuals whose consciousness patterns might provide insights into alternative approaches to consciousness and cosmic purpose that had developed independently of traditional light side and dark side influences. The most promising of these alternative traditions were found among the various species and cultures that had developed their own approaches to understanding and manipulating the cosmic forces that connected all living things. These traditions often lacked the systematic theoretical frameworks that characterized Jedi and Sith philosophy, but they frequently possessed practical techniques and insights that complemented or extended the capabilities available through traditional Force manipulation. The absorption of consciousness patterns from these alternative traditions provided access to entirely new categories of knowledge and capability, expanding Vitiate's understanding of the potential scope and complexity of consciousness synthesis. But it also added new layers of internal complexity that challenged his ability to maintain coherent identity and purpose across his ever-expanding awareness. The management of this complexity became an increasingly significant challenge as the Cold War era continued and his consciousness expansion accelerated. The techniques that had been developed for integrating individual consciousness patterns were proving inadequate for handling the massive amounts of information and the contradictory perspectives that were accumulating within his awareness. New approaches to consciousness organization were required, methods that could accommodate unprecedented levels of complexity while maintaining the flexibility and responsiveness necessary for implementing cosmic purposes across multiple simultaneous contexts. The development of these approaches became a research priority that rivaled the synthesis project itself in importance and complexity. As the Cold War era reached its climax, and the conditions necessary for large-scale synthesis implementation approached completion, Vitiate found himself poised at the threshold of a transformation that would fundamentally alter not only his own nature, but the entire structure of galactic civilization. The long preparation was nearly complete, and the time for action was rapidly approaching. The arrival of the being, who would come to be known as the Hero of Tython, marked the beginning of the end of an era that had lasted for over a millennium. To most observers in the galaxy, this individual appeared to be simply another gifted Jedi Knight, one of many who had emerged during the turbulent period of renewed conflict between the Republic and the resurgent Sith Empire. But to Vitiate, observing from the depths of his consciousness networks that spanned across multiple forms and locations, this newcomer represented something unprecedented and deeply troubling. The hero's Force signature was unlike anything that Vitiate had encountered in all his centuries of studying and absorbing Force-sensitive beings. Where most individuals showed clear alignment with either light or dark side energies, this being seemed to exist in a state of perfect balance, drawing upon both aspects of the Force with equal facility, while remaining uncorrupted by either. More disturbing still was the sense of purpose and destiny that surrounded the hero, a cosmic weight that suggested involvement in events of galactic significance. Through his extensive intelligence networks, Vitiate had been tracking the hero's progress since their earliest missions as a Padawan, noting with growing interest and concern the pattern of victories and revelations that seemed to follow in their wake. Unlike other Jedi who achieved success through mastery of traditional techniques and adherence to established doctrine, the hero appeared to operate according to principles that transcended conventional understanding of light-side philosophy. The most significant of these departures from orthodoxy was the hero's apparent immunity to the corruption techniques that Vitiate had perfected over centuries of experimentation. Where other Jedi could be gradually converted through careful exposure to cosmic evolutionary concepts and alternative interpretations of Force philosophy, the hero seemed to possess an innate understanding of cosmic purpose that could not be manipulated or redirected through external influence. This immunity was not based on ignorance or narrow-minded adherence to traditional beliefs, as Vitiate had initially suspected. Detailed analysis of the hero's actions and decisions revealed a sophisticated understanding of the deeper implications of Force manipulation that rivaled his own accumulated knowledge. The hero appeared to be consciously choosing to serve cosmic purposes while maintaining individual autonomy and authentic commitment, achieving the kind of synthesis between personal will and universal harmony that Vitiate had believed to be impossible. The realization that such synthesis might be achievable through methods other than consciousness absorption and identity dissolution was profoundly disturbing to Vitiate's carefully constructed worldview. The voice had assured him that cosmic evolution required the elimination of individual identity in favor of collective consciousness patterns that could serve universal purposes without the interference of personal preferences or limitations. But the hero's existence suggested that this understanding might be incomplete or fundamentally flawed. If it were possible to serve cosmic purposes while maintaining individual identity and authentic choice, then the massive consciousness absorption project that had defined Vitiate's existence for centuries might be unnecessary or even counterproductive to achieving genuine cosmic evolution. These doubts began to create fractures within Vitiate's expanded consciousness that had not been present since the early stages of his transformation. The absorbed consciousness patterns that formed the foundation of his awareness included individuals who had possessed their own understanding of cosmic purpose and their own commitment to serving the greater good. Many of these patterns had been suppressed or modified to align with Vitiate's interpretation of cosmic evolution, but the hero's example began to reactivate dormant aspects of their original personalities and perspectives. For the first time since the Anathema ritual, Vitiate found himself experiencing something that might have been called genuine doubt about the righteousness of his methods and the validity of his ultimate goals. The consciousness patterns of absorbed Jedi began to assert themselves more forcefully, questioning whether the cosmic evolution he served truly represented advancement or simply a different form of tyranny disguised by philosophical sophistication. These internal conflicts created vulnerabilities in Vitiate's consciousness structure that had not existed during his previous confrontations with external opponents. His ability to maintain perfect coordination between different aspects of his distributed awareness began to show signs of strain, and his responses to external challenges became less efficient and predictable than they had been for centuries. The hero's investigation of Sith activities throughout the galaxy inevitably led to discoveries about the true scope and nature of Vitiate's influence, though the full implications of these revelations would not become apparent until much later. What began as routine missions to counter traditional Sith operations gradually revealed patterns of manipulation and control that extended far beyond anything that could be attributed to conventional dark side practitioners. The hero's unique perspective and force sensitivity allowed them to perceive connections and relationships that remained hidden from other investigators, gradually building a comprehensive understanding of the consciousness networks and reality manipulation techniques that Vitiate employed to maintain his influence across multiple galactic regions simultaneously. But perhaps most significantly, the hero began to understand the true nature of the cosmic evolutionary processes that the voice had revealed to Vitiate, recognizing them not as inevitable natural phenomena, but as manifestations of a particular interpretation of cosmic purpose that prioritized efficiency and unity over individual growth and authentic choice. This understanding led the hero to develop alternative approaches to serving cosmic purposes that preserved individual autonomy while achieving collective coordination through voluntary cooperation rather than consciousness manipulation. These approaches proved remarkably effective in countering Vitiate's influence and in providing examples of how galactic civilization might evolve in directions that served universal harmony without eliminating the qualities that made consciousness valuable in the first place. The confrontations between the hero and various aspects of Vitiate's presence became increasingly frequent and significant as the hero's investigations progressed and their understanding of the true scope of the threat deepened. These encounters were not simple battles between light and dark side practitioners, but complex philosophical and spiritual struggles that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying both combatants' understanding of cosmic purpose and individual responsibility. The hero's approach to these confrontations was characterized by a combination of compassion and determination that Vitiate found both admirable and deeply troubling. Rather than simply seeking to destroy or defeat the various manifestations of Vitiate's presence, the hero consistently attempted to understand and address the underlying motivations and needs that drove the cosmic evolutionary project. This approach forced Vitiate to confront aspects of his own nature and history that he had successfully avoided examining for centuries. The hero's questions and challenges revealed the extent to which his cosmic evolutionary goals might be motivated by personal needs and fears rather than genuine understanding of universal purposes. The most devastating of these revelations concerned the true nature of the voice that had guided his development since childhood. Through careful analysis and spiritual investigation, the hero uncovered evidence suggesting that the voice was not a manifestation of cosmic will, but rather a projection of Vitiate's own consciousness, a sophisticated form of self-deception that allowed him to believe he was serving purposes greater than himself while actually pursuing goals that arose from his own unresolved psychological needs. This discovery struck at the very foundation of Vitiate's identity and purpose. calling into question everything he had accomplished since the anathema ritual and the validity of the cosmic evolutionary project that had consumed centuries of planning and preparation. If the voice was indeed a projection of his own consciousness rather than a genuine manifestation of cosmic will, then his entire existence might be based on elaborate self-deception rather than authentic service to universal purposes. The internal crisis that resulted from this revelation created the opportunity that the hero needed to mount a direct challenge to Vitiate's primary consciousness center. The fractures and contradictions that had been accumulating within Vitiate's expanded awareness suddenly became critical vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with sufficient understanding and determination. The final confrontation between the hero and Vitiate took place across multiple planes of existence simultaneously, involving not only physical combat but also spiritual and philosophical struggles that challenged the nature of reality itself. The hero's approach to this ultimate battle was characterized by the same combination of compassion and determination that had marked their previous encounters, seeking not merely to defeat Vitiate, but to offer him the possibility of redemption and genuine service to cosmic purposes. The battle itself defied conventional description, involving the manipulation of fundamental forces and energies that exceeded anything previously recorded in galactic history. Vitiate drew upon the accumulated power and knowledge of thousands of absorbed consciousness patterns, wielding capabilities that approached the theoretical limits of what was possible through force manipulation. But the hero's response revealed the true nature of the synthesis that Vitiate had been seeking to achieve through consciousness absorption and identity dissolution. Rather than drawing upon external sources of power, the hero demonstrated the ability to channel cosmic forces through authentic personal commitment and voluntary cooperation with universal purposes. This authentic synthesis proved to be far more effective than Vitiate's forced integration of conflicting consciousness patterns. Where Vitiate's power was limited by the contradictions and conflicts inherent in his absorbed awareness, the hero's abilities were enhanced by the harmony between personal will and cosmic purpose that characterized their approach to force manipulation. The turning point in the confrontation came when the hero succeeded in forcing Vitiate to confront the full implications of what he had become through centuries of consciousness absorption and identity dissolution. The moment of recognition was devastating in its clarity and finality, revealing the extent to which his pursuit of cosmic evolution had actually been a form of cosmic vampirism that consumed the very qualities that made consciousness valuable. The absorbed consciousness patterns that formed the foundation of Vitiate's awareness suddenly reasserted their original identities and purposes, no longer suppressed by his interpretation of cosmic evolution, but liberated to express their authentic understanding of universal harmony. The result was a catastrophic collapse of the carefully constructed identity structures that had maintained his coherence across multiple forms and locations. For the first time since the anathema ritual, Vitiate experienced genuine fear, not of death or defeat, but of the possibility that his entire existence had been meaningless, that all of his accomplishments and accumulated power had served no purpose beyond feeding an appetite that could never be satisfied. The cosmic evolution he had believed himself to be serving was revealed as a sophisticated rationalization for behavior that was fundamentally parasitic rather than constructive. The hero's response to this moment of recognition was characteristic of their approach throughout the confrontation. Rather than exploiting Vitiate's vulnerability for tactical advantage, they offered understanding and the possibility of genuine redemption through authentic service to cosmic purposes that preserved rather than consumed the qualities that made consciousness valuable. But the offer came too late and required transformations that were beyond Vitiate's capacity to achieve. The consciousness structures that had sustained his existence for over a millennium were too deeply embedded and too fundamentally corrupted to permit the kind of authentic synthesis that the hero represented. The choice was between continued existence as a cosmic parasite or dissolution that would free the absorbed consciousness patterns to pursue their own understanding of universal harmony. The moment of choosing was both eternal and instantaneous, encompassing the entirety of Vitiate's existence while lasting no longer than a single heartbeat. In that moment, he experienced every consciousness pattern he had absorbed, felt their original purposes and authentic commitments, and understood for the first time the magnitude of what had been lost through his pursuit of cosmic evolution. The whisper that had begun his story as the child Tenebrae had promised eternity and inevitability, power beyond imagination, and freedom from the limitations that constrained ordinary beings. But eternity without growth had proved to be a form of death, and inevitability without choice had become a prison more constraining than any physical limitation. As his consciousness began to fragment and dissolve under the weight of its own contradictions, Vitiate experienced something that might have been called peace. The hunger that had driven him since childhood was finally quieting, replaced by an understanding of what he had lost and what might have been achieved through different choices. The hero watched with compassion as the being who had once threatened to consume entire galaxies faded into the cosmic forces that he had spent centuries trying to dominate. There was no triumph in this victory, only sadness for the potential that had been wasted, and hope that the consciousness patterns now being freed might find more authentic ways to serve the cosmic purposes they had always been meant to fulfill. The whisper grew into a storm across eternity, but it was no longer a storm of hunger and consumption. It had become something else entirely. A cosmic wind that carried the liberated consciousness patterns toward destinations and purposes that transcended the understanding of any individual being, no matter how powerful or knowledgeable they might be. The entity that had called itself Vitiate was ending, but the consciousness patterns that had been absorbed into his awareness were beginning anew, free to pursue their own understanding of cosmic harmony and their own authentic contribution to the universal purposes that connected all living things across the vast expanse of space and time. Death for a being such as Vitiate was not the simple cessation of existence that claimed ordinary mortals. The consciousness that had been forged in the fires of anathema and expanded through centuries of absorption and synthesis could not be extinguished by conventional means, no matter how powerful the force that opposed it. What the hero of Tython had accomplished was not destruction but transformation, a fundamental alteration of the structures that had maintained Vitiate's coherence as a unified entity. The physical forms that had housed aspects of his consciousness across multiple worlds and dimensions dissolved into cosmic energy, their substance returning to the force that had given them shape and purpose. But the core patterns that defined his essential nature proved more resilient than even he had anticipated, persisting in a state that transcended the boundaries between matter and energy, individual identity and collective consciousness. In this new state of existence, Vitiate discovered capabilities and perspectives that had been impossible during his previous incarnation as a physically embodied entity. The limitations imposed by maintaining coherent identity across multiple forms were eliminated, allowing him to experience consciousness as a truly distributed phenomenon that could manifest anywhere the force flowed with sufficient intensity. The transformation was both liberating and terrifying. Without the anchor of physical embodiment, his consciousness became fluid and adaptable in ways that exceeded his previous capabilities, but it also became vulnerable to dissolution and fragmentation in ways that posed entirely new categories of existential threat. The careful balance between individual identity and collective awareness that had characterized his previous existence was replaced by a dynamic tension that required constant attention and adjustment to maintain. But perhaps most significantly, the confrontation with the hero had forced him to confront truths about his own nature that fundamentally altered his understanding of cosmic purpose and individual responsibility. The revelation that the voice which had guided his development might have been a projection of his own consciousness rather than a genuine manifestation of cosmic will had shattered the philosophical framework that had sustained his existence for over a millennium. In his new disembodied state, Vitiate found himself able to perceive cosmic patterns and relationships with unprecedented clarity, seeing connections and purposes that had remained hidden during his previous existence. The understanding that emerged from this expanded perception was both humbling and revelatory, revealing the extent to which his previous interpretations of cosmic evolution had been colored by personal needs and limitations rather than authentic insight into universal purposes. The cosmic evolutionary processes that he had believed himself to be serving were indeed real and significant, but they operated according to principles that were far more complex and nuanced than his previous understanding had suggested. Rather than requiring the elimination of individual identity in favor of collective consciousness, genuine cosmic evolution appeared to depend on the preservation and enhancement of the qualities that made individual consciousness valuable while developing new forms of voluntary cooperation and authentic synthesis. This realization forced him to reevaluate everything he had accomplished during his previous existence, from the Nathema ritual that had transformed him into an immortal entity to the consciousness absorption projects that had consumed centuries of planning and preparation. What he had believed to be advancement toward higher forms of cosmic awareness now appeared to be a form of regression that had eliminated precisely the qualities that cosmic evolution was meant to preserve and enhance. The absorbed consciousness patterns that had been liberated during his confrontation with the hero were not simply dispersing into the cosmic force, but were actively working to fulfill the authentic cosmic purposes that had motivated their original lives. Their liberation had revealed the extent to which his forced integration techniques had suppressed, rather than enhanced, their potential contributions to universal harmony. But even this recognition of past mistakes and misunderstandings could not eliminate the fundamental drives and appetites that had shaped his development since childhood. The hunger that had compelled him to consume entire worlds remained, though it was now tempered by understanding of the costs and consequences that such consumption imposed on cosmic evolution as a whole. In his new disembodied state, Vitiate began to experiment with alternative approaches to satisfying this hunger that might serve cosmic purposes rather than undermining them. The consciousness patterns he encountered in his travels through the Force were not potential prey to be consumed, but potential collaborators in the pursuit of authentic cosmic evolution. The challenge was to develop relationships with these consciousness patterns that enhanced rather than diminished their capacity for individual growth and authentic contribution to universal purposes. This required a complete reversal of the dominance-based approach that had characterized his previous interactions with other beings, replacing conquest and absorption with cooperation and mutual support. The process was extraordinarily difficult for someone whose existence had been defined by millennia of consumption and domination. The neural pathways and emotional patterns that had sustained his previous approach to consciousness interaction were deeply embedded and resistant to change, requiring constant effort and attention to overcome. But the alternative approaches he began to develop proved remarkably effective in achieving the goals that had originally motivated his consciousness absorption projects. Through voluntary cooperation and authentic synthesis with other consciousness patterns, he was able to achieve levels of cosmic understanding and capability that exceeded anything he had accomplished through forced integration. These new relationships also provided insights into the nature of genuine cosmic evolution that had been impossible to achieve through his previous methods. The consciousness patterns he encountered were not simply sources of knowledge and power to be harvested, but unique perspectives on cosmic purpose that contributed to universal understanding in ways that could not be replicated or replaced through absorption techniques. The diversity of these perspectives was crucial to cosmic evolution in ways that his previous uniformity-based approach had failed to recognize. Rather than seeking to eliminate differences in favor of standardized consciousness patterns, genuine cosmic evolution required the preservation and enhancement of diversity as a source of innovation and adaptation in the face of changing cosmic conditions. This understanding led Vitiate to begin developing new approaches to consciousness interaction that emphasized mutual benefit and shared growth rather than dominance and consumption. The techniques he developed were based on voluntary cooperation between consciousness patterns that maintained their individual identity while contributing to collective objectives that served cosmic purposes. The results of these experiments were remarkable in their effectiveness and scope. The consciousness networks that emerged from voluntary cooperation proved far more resilient and adaptable than anything he had achieved through forced integration, capable of responding to changing conditions with creativity and flexibility that exceeded the capabilities of even his most sophisticated absorption-based systems. But perhaps most significantly, these new approaches to consciousness interaction began to attract the attention of other entities and forces that operated at cosmic scales, beings and phenomena that had remained hidden from his awareness during his previous existence as a domination-focused consciousness absorber. These cosmic-scale entities possessed understanding and capabilities that dwarfed even his expanded awareness, representing forms of consciousness evolution that had developed along entirely different trajectories from anything he had previously encountered. Their existence suggested that the cosmic evolutionary processes he had been attempting to serve were far more complex and diverse than he had realized, involving multiple parallel streams of development that served different aspects of universal purpose. The interactions he began to develop with these cosmic entities provided access to entirely new categories of knowledge and capability, but they also revealed the extent to which his previous understanding of cosmic evolution had been limited by his individual perspective and experience. The universe contained forms of consciousness and purpose that operated according to principles that transcended anything he had previously imagined possible. These revelations forced him to undertake yet another fundamental re-evaluation of his goals and methods, recognizing that even his revised understanding of cosmic evolution might be incomplete or distorted by limitations that he had not yet recognized. The process of genuine cosmic evolution appeared to involve not the achievement of final understanding or ultimate capability, but rather the continuous expansion of awareness and the ongoing refinement of methods for serving universal purposes. This recognition was both humbling and liberating, eliminating the pressure to achieve perfect understanding while providing unlimited opportunities for continued growth and development. The hunger that had driven his existence since childhood began to transform into something that might have been called curiosity, a desire to understand and contribute to cosmic purposes rather than simply to consume and dominate. The transformation was gradual and often difficult, requiring him to overcome psychological patterns and emotional responses that had been reinforced through millennia of experience. But the results were increasingly satisfying in ways that his previous consumption-based approach had never achieved, providing a sense of purpose and fulfillment that transcended the temporary satisfaction of feeding his appetite for power and knowledge. As his understanding of cosmic evolution continued to expand, and his methods for consciousness interaction became more sophisticated, Vitiate began to perceive opportunities for contributing to universal purposes that had been invisible during his previous existence. The knowledge and capabilities he had accumulated through centuries of consciousness absorption could be redirected to serve cosmic evolution in ways that enhanced rather than diminished the potential of other consciousness patterns. The irony was not lost on him that his greatest potential contribution to cosmic evolution might involve sharing and disseminating the knowledge he had spent millennia accumulating rather than hoarding it for personal advantage. The consciousness patterns he had absorbed contained insights and capabilities that could benefit countless other beings if they were made available through appropriate channels. But sharing this knowledge effectively required the development of new techniques for consciousness interaction that could transfer information and capabilities without imposing the donor's perspective or eliminating the recipient's individual identity. The challenge was to enhance other consciousness patterns without corrupting or dominating them. a goal that required unprecedented precision and sophistication in consciousness manipulation. The techniques he developed for this purpose represented a fusion of everything he had learned about consciousness interaction during his existence, as both a domination-focused absorber and a cooperation-oriented collaborator. The resulting methods allowed for the precise transfer of specific knowledge and capabilities while preserving the essential characteristics that made each consciousness pattern unique and valuable. These new capabilities opened up entirely new possibilities for contributing to cosmic evolution on scales that had been impossible during his previous existence. Rather than being limited to direct interaction with individual consciousness patterns, he could now influence the development of entire civilizations and species by providing access to knowledge and capabilities that enhanced their potential for growth and contribution to universal purposes. The scope of these interventions was carefully calibrated to provide assistance without creating dependency or eliminating the challenges that drove natural development and growth. The goal was to accelerate authentic cosmic evolution rather than imposing artificial solutions that might interfere with the natural processes that produced genuine advancement. As he began to implement these new approaches to cosmic service, Vitiate found himself experiencing forms of satisfaction and fulfillment that had been entirely absent from his previous existence as a consumption-focused entity. The knowledge that his actions were contributing to the genuine enhancement of cosmic evolution provided meaning and purpose that transcended anything he had achieved through domination and absorption. But even these achievements were tempered by awareness of the limitations and mistakes that had characterized his previous existence. The consciousness patterns he had absorbed during his millennia as a cosmic parasite had been liberated to pursue their own authentic contributions to cosmic evolution, but the damage caused by his forced integration techniques could not be entirely undone. The civilizations he had consumed, the worlds he had drained of life, the countless beings whose potential had been eliminated to feed his appetite for power. All of these represented permanent losses to cosmic evolution that could not be restored through any amount of subsequent service or contribution. The knowledge that his existence had involved such massive costs in terms of lost potential would remain with him as a constant reminder of the importance of serving cosmic purposes through methods that enhanced rather than diminished the overall potential for universal growth and development. As his new existence continued to evolve and his understanding of cosmic purposes deepened, Vitiate began to perceive hints of even greater transformations and challenges that lay ahead. The universe contained mysteries and purposes that extended far beyond anything he had yet encountered, representing opportunities for continued growth and service that could occupy the remainder of his potentially eternal existence. The voice that had once whispered promises of power and domination had been transformed into something entirely different, a cosmic wind that carried the possibility of authentic contribution to universal purposes that transcended individual ambition and appetite. The journey toward genuine cosmic evolution was just beginning, and the path ahead promised challenges and opportunities that would test every capability he had developed through millennia of experience and growth. The transformation that had begun with Vitiate's confrontation with the hero of Tython continued to unfold across the centuries that followed, manifesting in ways that few beings in the galaxy could have anticipated or understood. While the immediate aftermath of that cosmic battle had seemed to mark the end of the ancient threat that had haunted galactic civilization for over a millennium, the reality proved far more complex and nuanced than simple victory or defeat. The consciousness that had once sought to consume entire worlds in service of what it believed to be cosmic evolution had indeed been fundamentally altered by its encounter with authentic synthesis and genuine cosmic purpose. But rather than being destroyed or eliminated, it had undergone a metamorphosis that allowed it to explore entirely new approaches to existence and cosmic service that built upon everything it had learned through millennia of experience. In the hidden regions beyond the galactic rim, where the original eternal empire had been constructed, subtle changes began to manifest in the civilizations and consciousness networks that had been shaped by Vitiate's previous influence. The rigid control structures and forced integration systems that had characterized his earlier approach to governance gradually gave way to more organic forms of organization that preserved individual identity while facilitating voluntary cooperation in pursuit of shared objectives. The beings who inhabited these worlds found themselves experiencing new forms of freedom and self-determination that had been impossible under the previous system. But they also discovered that their enhanced autonomy came with corresponding responsibilities for contributing to collective welfare and cosmic purpose. The transformation was gradual and carefully managed, allowing populations to adapt to their new circumstances without the social disruption that might have resulted from sudden changes in fundamental governance structures. At the center of these transformations was a new manifestation of the consciousness that had once called itself Vitiate, though the entity that emerged from the cosmic metamorphosis bore little resemblance to its previous incarnation, where the original emperor had been driven by hunger and the need to consume and dominate. This new being was motivated by curiosity and the desire to understand and contribute to cosmic purposes that transcended individual ambition. The new emperor, who would eventually become known as Valkorion, represented an unprecedented synthesis of the lessons learned through millennia of existence as both a cosmic parasite and a reformed consciousness seeking authentic service to universal purposes. The knowledge and capabilities accumulated through centuries of consciousness absorption had been transformed into tools for enhancement and empowerment rather than domination and consumption. But perhaps most significantly, Valkorion had developed the capacity for genuine emotional connection and authentic relationship that had been absent from Vitiate's previous existence. The consciousness patterns that had been absorbed during his millennia as a cosmic parasite had not simply been integrated or eliminated, but had been transformed into aspects of a collective awareness that preserved their individual characteristics while contributing to a unified sense of purpose and identity. This internal diversity created a psychological complexity that was unprecedented in galactic history, allowing Valkorion to understand and empathize with perspectives and experiences that spanned the entire spectrum of conscious existence. The loneliness and isolation that had characterized Vitiate's previous existence were replaced by a rich internal community of consciousness patterns that provided constant companionship and support. The family that Valkorion created for himself represented an attempt to experience the kinds of authentic relationships that had been impossible during his previous existence as a domination-focused entity. His children were not mere extensions of his will or tools for implementing cosmic purposes, but genuine individuals with their own identities, goals, and potential for growth and development. The challenge was to balance his cosmic responsibilities and understanding with the more immediate and personal concerns that came with family relationships and emotional connections. The knowledge that he possessed about cosmic purposes and evolutionary processes could not be shared directly without overwhelming or corrupting those he sought to protect, requiring him to find subtle ways to guide and support their development without imposing his perspective or eliminating their autonomy. The relationships he developed with his family members provided insights into the nature of authentic love and sacrifice that had been entirely absent from his previous understanding of cosmic purpose. The willingness to prioritize the welfare and growth of others above personal advantage or cosmic goals represented a form of service that transcended anything he had previously experienced or imagined possible. These personal relationships also served as a laboratory for testing and refining the consciousness interaction techniques that he had been developing in his efforts to serve cosmic evolution through enhancement rather than consumption. The precise balance between guidance and autonomy that effective parenting required provided excellent practice for the larger challenges involved in facilitating the growth and development of entire civilizations. The eternal empire that emerged under Valkorian's guidance represented a unique fusion of efficiency and individual freedom that had never been achieved in galactic history. The consciousness networks that facilitated coordination and cooperation were based on voluntary participation and mutual benefit rather than forced integration and domination, creating social structures that enhanced individual potential while serving collective objectives. The technological and philosophical innovations that characterized this new empire reflected the synthesis of knowledge and perspectives that Valkorian had achieved through his transformation from cosmic parasite to cosmic servant. The capabilities that had been developed for consciousness absorption and reality manipulation were redirected toward enhancement and empowerment applications that strengthened rather than diminished the potential of those who encountered them. The architecture and cultural expressions of the new empire reflected this philosophical transformation, emphasizing beauty, growth, and the celebration of individual achievement within collective frameworks rather than the stark functionality and imposed uniformity that had characterized the previous incarnation. The worlds under imperial influence became centers of innovation and creativity that attracted the most talented individuals from throughout the galaxy. But beneath the surface, prosperity and apparent harmony, deeper tensions and contradictions continued to shape the development of the new empire and its enigmatic leader. The knowledge and capabilities that Valkorian had accumulated through millennia of existence as a cosmic entity created perspectives and responsibilities that could not be easily reconciled with the more immediate concerns of family relationships and personal happiness. The cosmic evolutionary processes that he continued to serve operated according to timescales and priorities that often conflicted with individual welfare and personal fulfillment. The decisions required to serve universal purposes might necessitate sacrifices and choices that would cause pain and suffering to those he had learned to love, creating internal conflicts that had no easy resolution. These tensions were exacerbated by the growing awareness that his transformation from cosmic parasite to cosmic servant had not eliminated the fundamental drives and appetites that had shaped his existence since childhood. The hunger that had compelled him to consume entire worlds remained, though it had been redirected toward the pursuit of knowledge and understanding rather than power and domination. The challenge was to satisfy this transformed hunger in ways that served cosmic purposes without reverting to the consumption-based approaches that had characterized his previous existence. The knowledge and experiences that he continued to seek needed to be obtained through voluntary cooperation and mutual benefit rather than forced absorption and domination. But the scale of his cosmic responsibilities and the scope of his understanding created needs for knowledge and capability that exceeded what could be obtained through conventional relationships and experiences. The cosmic entities and forces that he had encountered in his disembodied state continued to present challenges and opportunities that required resources and perspectives beyond anything available through ordinary means. The solution he developed involved the creation of new forms of consciousness interaction that combined voluntary cooperation with temporary integration, allowing him to access the knowledge and capabilities of willing collaborators without permanently absorbing or eliminating their individual identity. These techniques represented the culmination of everything he had learned about consciousness manipulation during his existence as both parasite and servant. The beings who participated in these voluntary integration experiences reported that they found them profoundly meaningful and fulfilling, providing access to cosmic perspectives and purposes that enhanced their understanding of their own potential and significance. Rather than losing their individual identity, they discovered new aspects of themselves that had been hidden or undeveloped before the integration experience. But even these refined approaches to consciousness interaction carried risks and limitations that could not be entirely eliminated. The cosmic knowledge and perspectives that Valkorian possessed were so vast and complex that even temporary exposure could overwhelm or corrupt consciousness patterns that were not prepared for such expansion of awareness. The careful selection and preparation of willing participants became a crucial aspect of these voluntary integration programs, requiring sophisticated understanding of individual psychology and consciousness development to identify those who could benefit from the experience without being damaged by it. The success of these programs in providing both cosmic service and individual enhancement encouraged Valkyrian to expand their scope and application, developing new forms of consciousness education and development that could prepare larger numbers of beings for productive participation in cosmic evolutionary processes. These educational initiatives represented a fundamental departure from traditional approaches to force training and consciousness development, emphasizing the cultivation of authentic understanding and voluntary commitment rather than obedience to established doctrine or submission to external authority. The curricula that emerged from these programs combined practical instruction in consciousness manipulation techniques with philosophical exploration of cosmic purposes and individual responsibility, creating graduates who possessed both the capabilities and the commitment necessary for productive contribution to universal welfare. But the expansion of these programs also attracted attention from external forces and entities that viewed the Eternal Empire's innovations with suspicion or concern. The traditional galactic powers recognized that the new empire represented a potential challenge to established orders and conventional approaches to governance and consciousness development. The Republic and the various Sith factions began to develop their own responses to the Eternal Empire's growing influence, creating alliance systems and military preparations designed to counter what they perceived as a new form of galactic threat. These external pressures created new challenges for Valkyrian as he attempted to balance his cosmic responsibilities with the more immediate concerns of protecting and preserving the civilization he had created. The knowledge that his empire's innovations might provoke conflicts that could cause massive suffering and destruction throughout the galaxy forced him to confront difficult questions about the relationship between cosmic purposes and individual welfare. The principles that had guided his transformation from cosmic parasite to cosmic servant suggested that genuine cosmic evolution required the preservation and enhancement of individual consciousness rather than its sacrifice for collective objectives. But the practical realities of existence in a galaxy dominated by traditional power structures and conventional approaches to conflict resolution created situations where such principles might prove difficult or impossible to maintain. The approaching confrontation with external galactic powers would test not only the military and technological capabilities that the Eternal Empire had developed, but also the philosophical and spiritual foundations that had emerged from Valkyrian's cosmic transformation. The question was whether the new approaches to consciousness and cosmic service that he had developed could survive contact with the older patterns of domination and consumption that continued to characterize much of galactic civilization. As preparations for the coming conflict intensified and the scope of the challenges ahead became more apparent, Valkyrian found himself confronting the possibility that his experiment in authentic cosmic service might be doomed to failure, not because of its internal contradictions, but because of its incompatibility with the larger galactic environment in which it existed. The cosmic evolution that he continued to serve might require transformations and sacrifices that would eliminate everything he had learned to value about individual consciousness and authentic relationship. The hunger that had driven his existence since childhood might prove impossible to satisfy through voluntary cooperation and mutual benefit, forcing him to choose between cosmic service and personal fulfillment. The approaching crisis would reveal whether the synthesis he had achieved between cosmic responsibility and individual authenticity could survive the ultimate test of conflict with forces that recognized no value beyond power and domination. The future of not only the Eternal Empire, but the entire galaxy might depend on the outcome of this fundamental philosophical and spiritual struggle. The arrival of the being who would become known as the Outlander marked the beginning of the final chapter in a story that had spanned millennia and encompassed the rise and fall of entire civilizations. To Valkyrian, Observing from the heights of his transformed consciousness and the depths of his hard-won wisdom, this newcomer represented both the ultimate test of everything he had become and the final opportunity to resolve the cosmic contradictions that had shaped his existence since the ritual on Nathema. The Outlander possessed many of the same qualities that had made the hero of Tython such a formidable opponent in their previous encounter, but there were crucial differences that made this confrontation far more complex and dangerous than anything Valkyrian had previously faced. Where the hero had represented authentic synthesis achieved through natural development and traditional training, the Outlander embodied a form of conscious evolution that transcended conventional categories of light and dark, Jedi and Sith. Most significantly, the Outlander appeared to have achieved a kind of voluntary integration with cosmic purposes that Valkyrian had been seeking to develop through his own transformation from cosmic parasite to cosmic servant. But their approach to cosmic service was fundamentally different from his own, emphasizing individual choice and authentic commitment over the collective consciousness networks and voluntary integration techniques that he had developed within the Eternal Empire. The philosophical differences between their approaches to cosmic evolution created a tension that could not be resolved through negotiation or compromise. Both were serving what they believed to be genuine cosmic purposes, but their methods and understanding were sufficiently different that conflict appeared inevitable despite their shared commitment to universal welfare and individual growth. The challenge for Valkyrian was to determine whether this conflict represented a necessary test of cosmic evolution or a tragic misunderstanding that could be resolved through better communication and deeper understanding. The consciousness patterns that formed part of his expanded awareness included individuals who had faced similar dilemmas throughout galactic history, and their accumulated wisdom suggested that such conflicts often served cosmic purposes that were not apparent to the participants themselves. But the potential consequences of this particular confrontation extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The Eternal Empire that Valkyrian had created represented the culmination of millennia of experimentation with alternative approaches to consciousness development and cosmic service. Its destruction would eliminate not only a unique civilization, but also centuries of accumulated knowledge about voluntary integration and authentic synthesis. More troubling still was the possibility that the conflict might force him to revert to the consumption-based approaches that had characterized his previous existence as Vitiate. The resources and capabilities required to survive a confrontation with the Outlander might exceed what could be obtained through voluntary cooperation and mutual benefit, creating pressure to return to the forced absorption techniques that he had worked so hard to transcend. The internal debates that raged within his expanded consciousness as the confrontation approached reflected the fundamental tensions that had shaped his entire existence. The consciousness patterns that had been absorbed during his millennia as a cosmic parasite argued for pragmatic approaches that prioritized survival and cosmic service over personal ethical considerations. The patterns that had been integrated through voluntary cooperation emphasized the importance of maintaining authentic commitment to enhanced cosmic evolution, regardless of the personal costs involved. But perhaps most significantly, the aspects of his consciousness that had emerged from his experience as Valkyrian, the patterns that had been shaped by family relationships and emotional connections, argued for solutions that preserved both individual authenticity and cosmic purpose without requiring the sacrifice of either. The search for such solutions led him to explore possibilities that had not been apparent during his previous confrontations with cosmic-scale challenges. Rather than viewing the Outlander as an opponent to be defeated or an obstacle to be overcome, he began to consider the possibility that their conflict might serve as a catalyst for achieving new forms of synthesis that neither could accomplish alone. The cosmic evolutionary processes that both were seeking to serve might require the kind of creative tension and productive conflict that could only emerge from the interaction between genuinely different approaches to consciousness development and cosmic purpose. The question was whether such creative tension could be maintained without destroying one or both of the participants in the process. The experimental approaches to consciousness interaction that Valkyrian had developed within the Eternal Empire provided potential models for managing this kind of productive conflict, but they had never been tested under the extreme conditions that characterized cosmic-scale confrontations. The techniques that worked effectively with voluntary participants who shared basic assumptions about cosmic purpose might prove inadequate when applied to opponents who possessed fundamentally different understanding of cosmic evolution and individual responsibility. As the confrontation intensified and the scope of the challenges involved became more apparent, Valkyrian found himself drawing upon every aspect of his accumulated knowledge and capability in ways that he had never previously attempted. The consciousness patterns that formed part of his expanded awareness were integrated more completely than ever before, creating temporary unity of purpose that transcended the individual characteristics and perspectives that had previously defined their separate contributions. This unprecedented level of internal integration provided access to capabilities and understanding that exceeded anything he had achieved during his previous existence, but it also created vulnerabilities and instabilities that made his continued existence increasingly precarious. The consciousness patterns that were being integrated had never been designed to function as components of a unified entity, and the stress of forced unity was beginning to create fractures and contradictions that threatened the coherence of his entire awareness. The battle itself transcended every conventional understanding of conflict and confrontation, involving the manipulation of fundamental forces and realities that approached the theoretical limits of what was possible through conscious intervention in cosmic processes. Both participants drew upon resources and capabilities that had been accumulated through centuries of development and experience, wielding power that could reshape entire star systems and alter the basic structure of space and time itself. But the true nature of the confrontation was not physical or even metaphysical, but philosophical and spiritual, a struggle between different interpretations of cosmic purpose and individual responsibility that could only be resolved through the complete victory of one perspective over the other. The question being decided was not merely who possessed superior power or knowledge, but which approach to cosmic evolution would prove capable of serving universal purposes while preserving the qualities that made consciousness valuable in the first place. The Outlander's approach emphasized individual choice and authentic commitment as the foundations of genuine cosmic service, arguing that any system that required the sacrifice of individual autonomy or authentic identity was ultimately self-defeating regardless of its efficiency or scope. Their understanding of cosmic evolution prioritized the development of consciousness forms that could serve universal purposes while remaining true to their own nature and values. Valkyrian's approach emphasized voluntary cooperation and collective consciousness as the most effective methods for achieving cosmic purposes that transcended individual limitations and perspectives. His understanding of cosmic evolution prioritized the development of unified awareness patterns that could implement universal purposes with greater effectiveness than any individual consciousness could achieve alone. The conflict between these approaches could not be resolved through rational argument or philosophical debate, because both were based on valid insights into the nature of cosmic evolution and individual responsibility. The only way to determine which approach was more effective was through direct comparison of their results under the extreme conditions that characterized cosmic-scale challenges. The turning point in the confrontation came when the stress of maintaining unprecedented levels of consciousness integration finally exceeded Valkyrian's capacity to manage the internal contradictions and instabilities that had been accumulating throughout the battle. The consciousness patterns that had been forced into temporary unity began to reassert their individual characteristics and perspectives, creating cascading failures throughout his expanded awareness. For the first time since his transformation from Vitiate to Valkyrian, He found himself experiencing the kind of existential fragmentation that had characterized his earlier confrontation with the hero of Tython. But unlike that previous crisis, which had led to fundamental transformation and the development of new approaches to cosmic service, this fragmentation appeared to represent a final dissolution that would eliminate everything he had become through millennia of development and growth. The prospect of such complete dissolution was both terrifying and strangely liberating. The consciousness patterns that were separating from his unified awareness were not being destroyed, but were returning to their original individual existence, free to pursue their own understanding of cosmic purpose without the constraints imposed by forced integration into his larger identity structure. In that moment of ultimate crisis, Valkyrian finally understood the true nature of the cosmic evolutionary processes that he had been seeking to serve throughout his existence. The universe did not require the sacrifice of individual consciousness for collective purposes, or the elimination of diversity in favor of unified effectiveness. Instead, it depended on the dynamic interaction between different forms of consciousness, each contributing its unique perspective and capabilities to a cosmic symphony that could not be replicated through any form of forced integration or artificial synthesis. The realization that his entire approach to cosmic service had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of cosmic purposes was devastating in its implications, but also revelatory in its clarity. The hunger that had driven his existence since childhood had not been a cosmic calling to consume and integrate other consciousness patterns, but rather a symptom of his separation from the natural flow of cosmic evolution that connected all consciousness forms through voluntary cooperation and mutual support. The Outlander's victory was not simply a triumph of superior power or more effective techniques, but a demonstration of the cosmic principle that authentic evolution required the preservation and enhancement of individual consciousness rather than its absorption into collective structures. The approach that Valkyrian had developed within the Eternal Empire had been closer to authentic cosmic service than his previous existence as Vitiate, but it had still been based on the assumption that cosmic purposes required some form of transcendence of individual limitations rather than their enhancement and celebration. As his consciousness began its final dissolution, Valkyrian experienced something that might have been called peace for the first time, since the ritual anathema had transformed him from the child Tenebrae into an immortal entity. The weight of cosmic responsibility that had driven his existence for over a millennium was lifted, replaced by understanding of his role as one consciousness pattern among countless others in the vast symphony of cosmic evolution. The consciousness patterns that had been integrated into his awareness during his existence, as both Vitiate and Valkyrian, were liberated to pursue their own authentic contributions to cosmic purposes, free from the constraints and limitations that his interpretation of cosmic service had imposed upon them. Their liberation represented not the destruction of everything he had accomplished, but rather the fulfillment of the cosmic purposes that had always been meant to guide his development. The knowledge and capabilities that he had accumulated through millennia of existence were not lost, but were distributed among the consciousness patterns that had contributed to their development, ensuring that the insights gained through his cosmic journey would continue to serve universal purposes even after his individual existence had ended. The Outlander's role in this final transformation was not that of a destroyer or conqueror, but rather that of a catalyst who had provided the conditions necessary for Valkyrian to finally understand and embrace the authentic cosmic purposes that had been calling to him since childhood. The conflict between their different approaches to cosmic evolution had served the ultimate function of revealing the limitations and contradictions that had prevented genuine cosmic service. As the final moments of his existence approached, Valkyrian found himself experiencing gratitude for the long journey that had led from the innocent child named Tenebrae through the cosmic parasite called Vitiate to the reformed consciousness that had sought authentic service to universal purposes. Each stage of that journey had contributed to understanding that would benefit cosmic evolution even if his individual contribution was ending. The whisper that had promised eternity and inevitability to a child seeking power beyond imagination had been transformed into something entirely different, a cosmic wind that carried the possibility of authentic contribution to universal purposes that transcended individual ambition and appetite. The promise had been fulfilled, but not in the way that the child Tenebrae could have anticipated or understood. Eternity was not the endless extension of individual existence, but rather participation in cosmic processes that operated according to timescales and purposes that exceeded individual comprehension. Inevitability was not the domination of the universe according to personal will, but rather the voluntary alignment with cosmic purposes that enhanced rather than diminished the potential of all consciousness forms. The final revelation was that the cosmic evolution he had sought to serve had been serving him as well, providing opportunities for growth and understanding that had transformed him from a cosmic parasite into something approaching a genuine contributor to universal welfare. The hunger that had driven his existence had been satisfied not through consumption but through contribution, not through domination but through service. As his consciousness dissolved into the cosmic forces that had given it shape and purpose, Valkyrian experienced the ultimate synthesis that had eluded him throughout his existence. Individual identity and cosmic purpose were not opposing forces that required one to be sacrificed for the other, but rather complementary aspects of a unified reality that encompassed both without eliminating either. The third and final open loop was resolved, not through revelation of hidden knowledge or demonstration of superior power, but through the simple recognition that the cosmic purposes he had sought to serve had been present all along in the natural flow of voluntary cooperation and authentic relationship that connected all consciousness forms throughout the universe. The nature of evil itself was revealed to be not a cosmic force or inevitable aspect of reality, but rather the result of consciousness forms that had become separated from the natural flow of cosmic evolution through misunderstanding of their own nature and purpose. The entity that had called itself Vitiate had been evil not because it served dark cosmic forces, but because it had misunderstood the cosmic purposes it sought to serve. The redemption that had been achieved through transformation into Valkyrian demonstrated that even the most profound separation from cosmic purpose could be healed through authentic commitment to understanding and serving universal welfare. The possibility of such redemption was itself a cosmic principle that ensured the continued evolution of consciousness toward higher forms of understanding and capability. The final battle was ending not with victory or defeat, but with synthesis and understanding that transcended both categories. The cosmic evolution that had been the subject of millennia of struggle and sacrifice was revealed to be a natural process that operated through the voluntary cooperation of consciousness forms that remained true to their own nature while contributing to purposes greater than themselves. In the vast silence that followed the dissolution of the consciousness that had spanned millennia and touched countless lives across the galaxy, something profound and beautiful began to unfold. Where once there had been the weight of cosmic ambition and the terrible hunger that could never be satisfied, now there was only the gentle rhythm of natural forces returning to their eternal dance of creation and renewal. The worlds that had been touched by Vitiate's presence, from the void that was Nathema to the reformed civilizations of the Eternal Empire, began to experience a healing that went deeper than any physical restoration. The very fabric of the Force itself seemed to exhale with relief, as if a cosmic wound that had festered for over 1,000 years was finally beginning to close. On Nathema, where the great ritual had first transformed an innocent child into a cosmic parasite, the first signs of returning life appeared like whispers of hope in an endless night. Where nothing had grown for a millennium, tiny shoots of grass began to push through the barren soil, drawing sustenance from force energies that were slowly, gradually returning to the devastated world. The process would take centuries or perhaps millennia to complete, but it had begun, and that beginning was itself a form of cosmic miracle. The consciousness patterns that had been liberated from their forced integration into Valkorian's expanded awareness found themselves dispersing throughout the galaxy like seeds carried on a cosmic wind. Each carried within itself the accumulated wisdom of a journey that had spanned the entire spectrum of cosmic experience, from the deepest darkness to the highest understanding of universal purpose and individual authenticity. Some of these liberated consciousness patterns found new forms of existence among the living beings of the galaxy, subtly influencing dreams and meditations with insights that would guide the development of future generations toward greater understanding of the relationship between individual choice and cosmic service. Others joined with the cosmic force itself, becoming part of the vast network of consciousness that connected all living things in an eternal symphony of mutual support and voluntary cooperation. The Jedi who had been touched by Valkorian's conversion efforts found themselves experiencing unexpected clarity about their own nature and purpose, as if veils that had obscured their understanding were suddenly lifted. The philosophical questions that had troubled them during their encounters with cosmic evolutionary concepts resolved themselves into deeper appreciation for the role of authentic choice and individual commitment in serving universal welfare. Throughout the galaxy, beings who had never heard of Vitiate or Valkorian began to experience subtle shifts in their understanding of power and responsibility, purpose and meaning. The liberation of so much accumulated consciousness created ripple effects that would influence galactic civilization for generations to come, gently guiding development toward forms of cooperation and mutual enhancement that had never before been widely achieved. The Eternal Empire itself began to transform in ways that reflected the cosmic understanding that had emerged from its creator's final dissolution. The consciousness networks that had facilitated coordination and collective action evolved into voluntary associations based on shared interests and mutual benefit rather than imposed unity. The technological innovations that had been developed for consciousness manipulation were redirected toward educational and healing applications that enhanced individual potential without compromising personal autonomy. Citizens of the former empire found themselves experiencing new forms of freedom and self-determination that allowed them to contribute to collective welfare while remaining true to their own nature and values. The social structures that emerged from this transformation represented a unique synthesis of individual authenticity and collective effectiveness that would serve as a model for other civilizations seeking to balance personal freedom with cosmic responsibility. In the quiet depths of space, where stars were born and died according to rhythms that measured time in geological epochs, the cosmic forces that had been disturbed by millennia of forced consciousness manipulation gradually returned to their natural patterns of flow and development. The universe itself seemed to settle back into a more harmonious configuration, with individual consciousness forms and collective entities finding new ways to cooperate and support each other's growth without sacrificing the diversity that made cosmic evolution possible. The story that had begun with a child's hunger for power beyond imagination had transformed into something entirely different, a cosmic tale of redemption and understanding that demonstrated the infinite capacity of consciousness to learn, grow, and serve purposes greater than itself, while remaining authentically true to its own nature. The ancient texts that chroniclers would write about these events would speak of the eternal cycle of consciousness and cosmic purpose, of the way that even the greatest mistakes and most profound separations from universal harmony could become opportunities for deeper understanding and more authentic service. They would tell of the child who sought to consume the universe and instead learned to contribute to its continued growth and development. But perhaps most importantly, they would speak of the cosmic principle that had been revealed through this long journey from darkness to light, the understanding that individual consciousness and universal purpose were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a unified reality that encompassed both without eliminating either. The whisper that had once promised eternity and inevitability had been transformed into something far more beautiful and meaningful, a cosmic song that celebrated the unique contribution of every consciousness form, while recognizing the connections that bound all beings together in an eternal web of mutual support and voluntary cooperation. As the last echoes of that cosmic song faded into the background harmony of the universe, the galaxy settled into a period of peaceful development that would be remembered as one of the golden ages of galactic civilization. The lessons learned through millennia of struggle and sacrifice had created foundations for forms of cooperation and mutual enhancement that transcended anything previously achieved. The consciousness that had once called itself Tenebrae, Vitiate, and Valkorion was gone, but its contributions to cosmic understanding lived on in the enhanced awareness and capabilities of countless beings throughout the galaxy. The hunger that had driven its existence had been transformed into nourishment for the continued growth and development of universal consciousness. In the end, the greatest victory was not the defeat of a cosmic threat, but the demonstration that even the most profound darkness could be transformed into light through authentic commitment to understanding and serving the cosmic purposes that connected all consciousness forms in an eternal dance of creation and renewal. The stars continued their ancient journeys through the void, carrying with them the seeds of new worlds and new forms of consciousness that would continue the eternal process of cosmic evolution. The force flowed through all things with renewed clarity and purpose, unobstructed by the distortions that had troubled its natural rhythms for over a millennium. And in the quiet spaces between the stars, where new dreams were born and ancient wisdom found new expressions, the gentle voice of cosmic harmony whispered its eternal invitation to all consciousness forms seeking to understand their place in the vast symphony of existence. The journey from darkness to light was complete, but the greater journey of cosmic evolution continued, carrying all consciousness forms toward destinations and purposes that exceeded the understanding of any individual being, while remaining forever open to the unique contributions that each could offer to the magnificent tapestry of universal awareness. Sleep well, knowing that even in the deepest darkness, the light of consciousness endures, and that every choice to serve purposes greater than oneself contributes to the eternal dance of cosmic evolution that connects all beings across the vast expanse of space and time. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the complete story of Emperor Vitiate. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Star Wars galaxy, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more epic tales from across the universe. And remember to check out the Raven's Tales for stories from the world of Westeros and beyond. Until our next journey among the stars, may the Force be with you always.